The true story of Rome begins long before the first marble columns gleamed proudly beneath the Italian sun, originating in a landscape that modern travelers would find unrecognizable in its wild, uncorrupted state. Around the year 1000 before Christ, the region of Latium was a rugged, untamed wilderness of dense, ancient oak forests, thick caper bushes, and treacherous, stagnant marshes that lay dormant under the grey autumn skies. The Tiber River, broad, deep, and heavily laden with the yellow volcanic silt it washed down from the heights of the Apennine Mountains, carved a slow, meandering path toward the Tyrrhenian Sea, cutting directly through a low-lying valley prone to sudden, violent floods. Rising abruptly from this watery plain were 7 distinct, isolated volcanic hills: the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, and the Quirinal, rugged outcroppings that offered the early human inhabitants of the region their only viable refuge from the dangerous, malaria-ridden lowlands below. As you listen, let the centuries pass softly, and let Rome's story carry you into sleep. So, before we step through the gates of the ancient world, and you make yourself completely comfortable, take a brief moment to leave a like and subscribe to our channel. If you connect with these historical journeys, please let me know in the comments, as hearing from your thoughts is always an absolute honor. Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour of the night is it for you right now? Seeing your footsteps gather here, from all corners of the world, always brings a deep, unspeakable joy to this archive. Now, dim your lights, let the outside world fade into total silence, and let our journey begin. On the summits of these hills, beneath night skies completely unpolluted by the glare of modern civilization, and salted with an infinity of ancient stars, small, isolated clans of Latin and Sabine shepherds built their lives out of the rawest materials the earth provided. Their settlements were not grand urban centers, but modest, scattered clusters of circular and oval huts that clung tenaciously to the sloping topography of the hillsides. These primitive structures were constructed by driving thick oak posts deep into the natural channels of the volcanic tufa rock, weaving flexible wattle branches between the upright timber supports and packing the entire frame with heavy coats of river mud mixed with straw to seal the interior against the biting winter winds. The roofs, thatched with thick river reeds and long grasses, sloped low and heavy toward the earth to shed the seasonal rains, while a single, small opening at the apex allowed the acrid smoke from the central hearth fire to curl steadily upward into the evening air. Modern archaeologists digging deep into the dark, stratified soil of the Palatine Hill have uncovered the silent, material whispers of this long-forgotten world. They have mapped the precise alignments of the ancient post holes preserved within the bedrock, discovered fragments of coarse, hand-formed impasto pottery used to store grain, and uncovered the deep, grey ash stains left behind by domestic fires that died out nearly 3,000 years ago. To look upon these humble, prehistoric traces is to realize that the ultimate master of the Mediterranean world began as nothing more than a defensive patchwork of Iron Age villages, where ordinary human beings lived in constant proximity to the wild, dangerous forces of nature, their nights haunted by the distant howling of wolves that roamed through the nearby thickets. The Tiber River dictated the fundamental rhythm of these early people's existence, acting simultaneously as a life-giving resource and a formidable geopolitical barrier. It provided a steady supply of fresh water and fish to supplement their meager diet, but its truest significance lay in a unique geographical feature located precisely at the base of the 7 hills. Here, the river broadened and split around a small landmass known as Tiber Island, creating the first natural, shallow wading point from the sea, where travelers, shepherds, and ancient merchants could safely cross the river. This crossing point established a magnificent, highly strategic intersection between entirely different cultural zones. It connected the wealthy, technologically advanced Etruscan city-states that dominated the northern territories with the fertile agricultural plains of Campania and the early Greek colonies that dotted the southern coastlines of the Italian peninsula. Along these narrow, dirt tracks, long before any formal marketplace or currency existed, early traders guided pack mules, laden with precious commodities, across the Tiber ford. They exchanged ingots of raw bronze, fine Greek ceramics, and, most importantly, salt harvested from the coastal pans at the river's mouth, a critical resource for these agrarian communities, as salt was absolutely essential for preserving meat through the winter and maintaining the health of their livestock. The hilltops themselves provided an ideal structural framework for survival. Their steep, rocky cliffs were easily defensible against the unexpected raids of rival hill tribes, yet they remained close enough to the lowlands to allow the villagers to descend into the fertile valleys each morning to cultivate small plots of emmer, wheat, barley, and broad beans. Daily life for these early Latins unfolded within a slow, repetitive loop dictated entirely by the movement of the sun and the changing of the seasons. Men spent their daylight hours guiding slow-moving oxen across the rich volcanic soil, their calloused hands gripping the handles of primitive wooden plows, whose bronze-tipped blades caught the pale morning light, while women knelt within the dim, smoky interiors of the mud huts, using heavy stone querns to laboriously grind grain into coarse flour for flatbreads baked directly on the hot coals. Children were integrated early into this economy of necessity, spending their hours carrying river water in heavy clay vessels or gathering dry firewood from the sacred groves that lined the valleys. Wealth was measured, not in gold or silver coin, but in heads of cattle and the possession of basic iron and bronze tools, sickles for harvesting crops, axes for clearing the dense timber, and crude spears for defending the clan's territory. The spiritual worldview of these prehistoric hill dwellers was completely animistic, populated by a vast, invisible network of divine forces known as noumena. They did not conceive of their gods as grand, anthropomorphic figures with human personalities. Instead, they believed that a distinct, potent spiritual presence inhabited every significant feature of their physical environment. A spirit resided within the household hearthfire, Vesta, within the dark corners of the family food store, Penates, within the stone markers that designated the boundaries of their fields, Terminus, and within the steady, unpredictable current of the Tiber itself. There were no grand temples or professional priestly hierarchies in this prehistoric era. The father of the household acted as the primary religious mediator, executing simple rituals with a meticulous, terrifying precision at small altars constructed of rough stone and timber. They believed that the slightest error in a spoken formula or a ceremonial gesture would instantly shatter the Pax Diorum, the peace with the gods, inviting immediate catastrophe upon their families, crops, and herds, an obsession with ritual contract that planted the deep cultural seeds for what would later evolve into the rigid, formal systems of Roman law. As the centuries advanced toward the mid-8th century, before Christ, these isolated hill communities could no longer escape the broader, dynamic movements of the Mediterranean world. Increased trade brought them into steady contact with the sophisticated artistry, engineering techniques, and religious practices of their Etruscan neighbors, while Greek maritime exploration introduced the alphabet, poetry, and advanced social structures to the shores of Italy. Slowly, the invisible walls between the separate hill villages began to soften as shared religious festivals and the practical necessity of mutual defense began to forge a fragile, collective identity among the separate clans. They began to preserve oral traditions that linked their humble agrarian existence to a grander, epic destiny, weaving stories of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who had survived the destruction of his homeland to seek a new beginning in Latium. They could not yet imagine the marble forums, the sprawling aqueducts, or the million-man armies that would one day spring from this volcanic soil, but the foundational strands of Rome discipline, piety, adaptability, and the unyielding will to endure were already being woven tightly together in the quiet smoke of the huts by the Tiber. The transition from a scattered cluster of agrarian hilltop communities to a self-conscious, unified political entity is bound to the legendary figure of Romulus. According to the foundational mythos, deeply cherished by subsequent generations of Roman historians, the definitive marking of the city's sacred boundary, the Pomerium, occurred on the 21st of April in the year 753 before Christ. This foundational act was not merely a practical matter of territorial delineation, it was a deeply religious and existential transformation of the physical landscape. Romulus, acting with the formal authority of a divinely sanctioned ruler, hitched a white bull and a pristine cow to a bronze-ploughed share, tracing a deep furrow around the perimeter of the Palatine Hill. The earth thrown up by the plough represented the defensive walls, while the furrow itself symbolized the sacred moat. To cross this line without ritual permission was an act of profound sacrilege, a truth tragically demonstrated when Remus, mocking the modest height of the initial earthworks, leaped over the boundary and was instantly struck down by his brother, who declared that such would be the absolute fate of anyone who dared to breach Rome's defences. The infant city that Romulus established was a desperate, precarious enclave surrounded by skeptical and often hostile neighbours. Recognizing that the survival of his settlement depended upon a rapid expansion of its population, Romulus instituted a radical geopolitical policy of absolute asylum. He designated a specific wooded valley between the two peaks of the Capitoline Hill as a sanctuary open to all wanderers, fugitives, outlaws, and political exiles from the surrounding regions of Latium, Etruria, and the Sabine Hills. This open-door policy gave early Rome its defining structural character. It was, from its very first breath, a cosmopolitan city, a melting pot of disparate languages, cultures, and bloodlines forged into a singular, highly resilient social contract. However, this aggressive accumulation of landless men created an immediate demographic crisis, as the early settlement lacked a sufficient number of women to ensure the continuity of the generation. When the neighbouring communities repeatedly rejected Rome's formal requests for intermarriage, viewing the new settlement as a dangerous gang of brigands, Romulus engineered a calculated and desperate stratagem to secure the city's future. The event known to history as the Consualia Festival represented the violent resolution of this demographic crisis. Romulus invited the neighbouring Sabine tribes to a grand series of religious games and spectacles in honour of the god Consus. In the midst of the festivities, at a prearranged signal from the king, the Roman youth drew their weapons and seized the young Sabine women who had come to witness the games, driving their fathers and brothers out of the city in a state of absolute panic and outrage. This act of tactical betrayal triggered an immediate, bloody war of vengeance. The Sabine forces, led by the formidable king Titus Tatius, advanced upon the 5 hills, eventually gaining entrance to the Capitoline fortress through the infamous treachery of Tarpeia, a Roman maiden who opened the gates in exchange for what the Sabines wore on their left arms, hoping for their golden bracelets, but instead being crushed to death beneath their heavy shields. The war reached its apocalyptic climax in the low valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, a marshy space that would one day become the glorious Roman Forum. As the two armies clashed with savage ferocity, their weapons locked in a desperate struggle for existential dominance, the abducted Sabine women themselves rushed directly into the center of the battlefield. With their infants in their arms and their hair disheveled, they threw themselves between the clashing shields of their Roman husbands and their Sabine fathers, crying out that they would rather perish themselves than live as widows or orphans. This dramatic intervention completely shattered the momentum of the conflict. The warriors lowered their spears, moved by the profound realization that their families were now inextricably linked by blood and affection. Rather than pursuing mutual destruction, Romulus and Titus Tatius negotiated an extraordinary, permanent alliance, merging the two peoples into a single, unified state under a shared diarchy, with Rome as the seat of royal government. To govern this newly integrated population, Romulus established the core political and social institutions that would define the structural architecture of the Roman state for nearly a millennium. He selected 100 of the most experienced and noble family elders to form a royal advisory council, a body designated as the Senatus, derived from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. The descendants of these original 100 senators were granted an exclusive, hereditary social status as patricians, forming the permanent aristocratic elite of the city, while the broader, unprivileged population formed the plebs, or plebeians. Romulus also divided the entire citizen body into three distinct tribes based on their ethnic origins: the Ramnes, Latins, the Tities, Sabines, and the Luceres, Etruscans, and further subdivided each tribe into 10 curiae, or voting assemblies, establishing the early foundations of constitutional assembly and military recruitment that would dictate the political mechanics of the later republic. The closing chapters of Romulus's 37-year reign returned the narrative to the realm of cosmic myth and political suspicion. In the year 716 before Christ, while reviewing his army during a sudden, violent storm on the Campus Martius, the field of Mars, the sky darkened completely, and a dense, blinding cloud descended directly upon the royal tribunal. When the storm finally cleared, Romulus had vanished completely from the face of the earth. While the common people wept, believing their founder had been carried up to heaven by his father Mars to become the god Quirinus, dark rumors whispered through the crowded streets that the patricians, weary of the king's increasingly autocratic rule, had murdered him in the shadow of the storm, cutting his body into pieces beneath their heavy cloaks to hide their treason. Whether legend, murder, or metaphor, the disappearance of Romulus left the young city at its first structural crossroads, frozen in absolute silence beneath the Italian sky, its foundations securely laid, but its future completely untethered. The violent, storm-shrouded disappearance of Romulus left the young city of Rome stranded in a dangerous political vacuum. For a full year, the 100 patricians of the Senate ruled the state through a rotating system called the interregnum, where each senator held absolute power for 5 days before passing the royal fasces to the next. However, the common plebeians quickly grew restless under this fractured aristocratic dominion, demanding a single sovereign who could unify the volatile mixture of Latin and Sabine factions. To prevent an open civil fracture, the Senate looked outside the immediate walls of Rome to the quiet, rugged hills of the Sabines. They chose Numa Pompilius, a man born on the very traditional day of Rome's founding, who was widely renowned throughout the region for his strict austerity, deep philosophical contemplation, and unblemished righteousness. Numa felt no natural hunger for imperial power. He preferred the quiet peace of his rural estate to the chaotic, blood-stained politics of the Tiber. Yet, moved by the desperate pleas of Roman ambassadors and the clear signs of divine omens, he reluctantly accepted the crown, entering the city not as a conqueror at the head of an army, but as a priest determined to tame the savage, predatory nature of his new subjects. If Romulus had given Rome its physical walls and its military teeth, Numa Pompilius gave the city its soul, its laws, and its sacred institutional architecture. He recognized with a profound psychological precision that a state built exclusively on asylum, abduction, and constant territorial friction would inevitably consume itself in permanent civil war unless its internal moral character was deeply stabilized. Numa's 43-year reign was characterized by an absolute, unbroken peace, a historic anomaly where the swords of the legions remained entirely unbronzed by blood and the agricultural plain was cultivated without fear of sudden raid or burning barn. To shift the Roman consciousness away from predatory expansion, Numa constructed a complex, highly integrated framework of religious observance designed to make the invisible presence of the divine a continuous, regulating factor in every public decision and domestic transaction. The physical manifestation of this peaceful strategy began with the construction of the Temple of Janus at the base of the Argilatum, a strategic valley connecting the residential districts to the Forum. Janus, the ancient, two-faced deity of beginnings, doors, and transitions, was positioned as the cosmic guardian of the city's security. Numa decreed that the heavy double doors of the temple should serve as a political thermometer for the entire state. They were to stand wide open in times of war, allowing the city's protective energies to flow outward to support the soldiers on the frontier, but were to be securely locked and bolted in times of absolute peace, sealing the volatile forces of conflict inside. Throughout Numa's entire reign, the doors of Janus remained tightly closed, a silent, monumental testament to a generation that mastered the difficult arts of agrarian diplomacy, constitutional organization, and internal spiritual discipline. To ensure the technical accuracy and generational continuity of these religious practices, Numa established the formal, state-funded priesthoods that would dictate the public calendar of Rome for the next 1,000 years. He organized the College of Pontiffs, led by the Pontifex Maximus, the supreme bridge builder between the human world and the divine, who held absolute supervisory authority over all public sacrifices, funerals, and legal oaths. Alongside the pontiffs, Numa created the flamines, specialized priests dedicated exclusively to the daily rituals of the major deities. Flamen Dialis for Jupiter, Flamen Martialis for Mars, and Flamen Quirinalis for the deified Romulus. He also instituted the Fetiales, a unique college of diplomatic priests responsible for the sacred laws of international treaty and war. No Roman army could lawfully march to battle until a fetial priest had traveled directly to the enemy border, pronounced a formal demand for justice, and cast a burnt, iron-tipped spear into the hostile soil, ensuring that every military action was an act of legitimate defense sanctioned by heaven. The most intimate and spiritually significant of Numa's institutional creations was the relocation of the Vestal Virgins to a dedicated convent in the Roman Forum. He selected 4 young maidens from the noblest patrician families, binding them to an absolute vow of strict chastity for 30 years. Their singular, vital task was to tend the sacred, eternal hearth fire of Vesta, the goddess of the domestic and state home. The Romans believed that this flickering flame was the physical manifestation of the city's inner life force. If the fire should ever go out due to a Vestal's negligence, it was viewed as an omen of total, catastrophic ruin for the state, requiring the execution of the guilty priestess by being buried alive in a subterranean chamber outside the Colline Gate. The Vestals held an extraordinary, unprecedented position of legal autonomy in an otherwise strictly patriarchal society. They were free from the absolute control of their fathers, were escorted through the crowded streets by lictors, and held the unique power to pardon any condemned criminal who accidentally crossed their path. The cosmological balance of Numa's reign was further reinforced by a spectacular, divinely timed event that occurred during a period of sudden pestilence. According to ancient sources, a strange bronze shield of distinctive oval geometry, pinched tightly in the center like a figure 8, fell directly from the heavens into the king's hands during a sacred storm. Numa recognized this artifact as the Ancile, a celestial talisman sent by Jupiter to guarantee the permanent security and imperial destiny of Rome. To protect this priceless relic from theft, Numa commanded an extraordinarily skilled smith named Mamurius Veturius to construct 11 identical replicas. He then organized the Salii, or leaping priests of Mars, 12 patrician youths who clothed themselves in bronze breastplates, carried the 12 sacred shields through the streets each spring, and performed a highly synchronized, rhythmic war dance, striking their spears against the bronze to awaken the protective martial spirits of the earth. To stabilize the economic transactions and legal assemblies of the growing city, Numa completely overhauled the primitive calendar inherited from Romulus. The old system possessed only 10 months, leaving a chaotic, unmanaged void of 60 days during the winter freeze that routinely disrupted farming predictions and legal scheduling. Numa added the months of January, Ianuarius, named for Janus, and February, Februarius, the month of purification, to the calendar, aligning the civic year precisely with the 12 cycles of the moon. He carefully divided the 355 days into dies fasti days, when legal and political business could lawfully be conducted, and dies nefasti, sacred festival days reserved exclusively for the gods, where all markets, courts, and assemblies were mandated to fall completely silent. This structural organization of time injected a predictable, comforting stability into the daily lives of the citizens, transforming the frantic anxieties of survival into an orderly, ritualized, cosmic harmony. Legends whispered through the centuries that Numa's extraordinary, unearthly wisdom was derived from his secret, intimate relationship with a divine being named Egeria, a water nymph of the sacred springs. The king would slip away from the city alone under the cover of night, entering a deep, silent grove outside the Kamenei gate, where the cool waters bubbled from the earth. There, beneath the ancient trees and the starlit canopy, Egeria would reportedly reveal to Numa the exact legal formulas, structural reforms, and ritual demands required to sustain the peace of the state. When Numa died peacefully of old age in the year 673, before Christ, his loss was mourned by the entire population as if they had lost a father. He left behind a city that had transitioned from a fragile fort of outlaws into a deeply organized, sacred community bound by law, oath, and ritual stability, a foundation that would survive the violent reigns of the kings to come and shape the internal steel of the Roman character for all time. The profound 43-year peace of Numa Pompilius faded instantly with his passing, leaving the young city of Rome to confront a ruler of an entirely different structural template. The Senate, seeking to shake the state free from what some patricians viewed as a dangerous, softening domestic rust, chose Tullus Hostilius as Rome's third king. Tullus was the grandson of a legendary Roman hero who had fallen in the battles against the Sabines during the reign of Romulus, and he inherited every ounce of his ancestors' fierce, predatory martial pride. He looked upon the complex religious institutions, the sacred colleges of priests, and the peaceful diplomatic rituals established by Numa, not with reverence, but with a deep, pragmatic skepticism. Tullus firmly believed that an agrarian state, built by asylum and violence, could only survive if its military machine was continuously sharpened through aggressive territorial expansion. His reign would become defined by an absolute return to the sword, an era when the locked double doors of the Temple of Janus were violently thrown open once more, and Rome's regional geopolitics were written in the blood of her oldest neighbors. The defining crisis of Tullus Hostilius's reign was the apocalyptic collision with Alba Longa, the ancient Latin mother city located in the hills to the south. Alba Longa had long looked down upon Rome with an elder, aristocratic condescension, viewing the river settlement as a bastard colony of runaway slaves and criminals. However, as Rome's population surged and its agricultural borders expanded, cross-border cattle raids and territorial friction between the farmers of both states became chronic. When diplomatic envoys failed to secure mutual reparations, both cities mobilized their full military capabilities, marching their disciplined phalanxes into the plains between the hills. Yet, as the two armies stood face to face, their spears leveled in a tense, breathless standoff, the Alban dictator, Metius Fufetius, stepped forward to propose a radical, alternative resolution. He argued that a full-scale civil slaughter between two closely related Latin peoples would leave both states utterly defenseless against the powerful, predatory Etruscan armies waiting to sweep down from the north. To resolve the geopolitical dispute without destroying both societies, the two rulers agreed to place the sovereign destiny of their states upon a singular, ritualized trial by combat. By an extraordinary stroke of dynastic coincidence, each army possessed a set of triplet brothers of identical age, strength, and martial training, the Horatii, representing Rome, and the Curiatii, representing Alba Longa. The 6 youths stepped into the open space between the opposing shield walls, their bronze swords drawing sharp, glittering arcs through the heavy morning air. The initial clash was savage and chaotic. Within minutes, 2 of the Roman Horatii lay dead upon the blood-soaked earth, while all 3 of the Alban Curiatii were wounded, their heavy iron armor dripping with crimson stains. The Alban army raised a deafening roar of victory, believing the fate of Rome was securely sealed. The sole surviving Roman brother, completely outnumbered but entirely unhurt, recognized that he could not defeat 3 opponents simultaneously in a static frontal engagement. Utilizing a desperate, brilliant tactical retreat, he turned and fled across the field, drawing the wounded Curiatii after him in a ragged, uneven pursuit. As the Alban triplets stretched out across the plain, separated by the varying severity of their wounds, the Roman brother suddenly spun around to confront them one by one. He cut down the first, exhausted Alban brother before the others could arrive. He parried the frantic strokes of the second, piercing his throat with a swift, cold thrust, and finally executed the third, heavily bleeding Curiatii brother with an absolute, remorseless efficiency. The Roman victory was absolute. By the laws of the sacred contract, Alba Longa lowered her standards and swore a binding oath of total submission to the sovereign command of Rome. Yet, this forced submission bred a deep, smouldering resentment within the Alban leadership. When Rome subsequently engaged in a brutal war against the Etruscan city of Veii, Tullus Hostilius summoned the Alban forces under Metius Fufetius to fulfill their treaty obligations by standing on the Roman flank. However, as the Etruscan cavalry charged, Metius withdrew his troops to the nearby hills, waiting in cynical silence to see which side would triumph so he could align himself with the victor. Tullus, displaying a fierce, terrifying presence of mind, shouted to his panicked legions that the Alban movement was a prearranged, secret flanking maneuver commanded by the throne. Reassured by this brilliant tactical lie, the Roman soldiers fought with savage discipline, routing the Etruscans into the river. The vengeance that Tullus Hostilius visited upon Alba Longa for this battlefield betrayal was calculated to serve as a permanent, horrific lesson in state sovereignty. He marched his victorious legions directly to the ancient mother city, ordering his soldiers to systematically raze every stone palace, marketplace, and domestic home to the ground, leaving only the sacred temples of the gods standing amid the ruins. The entire population of Alba Longa, thousands of citizens whose lineages stretched back centuries before the founding of Rome, was forced to migrate to the banks of the Tiber. Tullus did not enslave these broken exiles. Instead, he integrated them fully into the fabric of the state, granting them lands on the Caelian hill and enrolling their noblest families, including the Julii, directly into the Roman patriciate, establishing the foundational Roman pattern of expanding imperial power by absorbing the human resources of the conquered. To accommodate this massive influx of new aristocratic families and formalize the expansion of the political elite, Tullus Hostilius constructed the first permanent stone assembly house for the advisory council, the Curia Hostilia. Located at the northern edge of the Comitium in the Forum, this high-ceilinged, austere hall stood for over 5 centuries as the physical heart of Roman governance, a space where the Senate debated treaties, directed legions, and managed the structural laws of the state. Yet, despite his civil and military triumphs, Tullus's absolute, lifelong neglect of religious piety and his arrogant disdain for the Pax Deorum eventually invited a terrifying, atmospheric retribution. In the final years of his 32-year reign, a violent pestilence swept through the crowded streets of Rome, breaking the physical health and martial spirit of the population. The king himself, struck down by a wasting fever, abandoned his cynical rationalism and fell into a state of frantic, superstitious panic. In a desperate attempt to force the favor of the heavens, Tullus attempted to execute a series of highly complex, archaic sacrifices to Jupiter Elysius, drawing upon the secret notebooks left behind by Numa Pompilius. However, due to his profound ignorance of the sacred mechanics and a minor technical error in the ritual formula, the sacrifice transformed into a catastrophic, cosmic failure. A sudden, blinding bolt of lightning ripped through the heavy storm clouds, striking the royal palace with absolute, fiery precision. The entire structure was instantly consumed by flames, and Tullus Hostilius perished amid the smoke and ash of his own hubris, a stern, mythic reminder to the early citizens that military dominance, when entirely severed from moral virtue and religious piety, will inevitably collapse under the weight of divine judgment. The ash-stained death of Tullus Hostilius left Rome in a state of deep spiritual anxiety, with its citizens fearing that the city had permanently alienated the heavens through decades of military arrogance and ritual neglect. Seeking to re-establish the critical equilibrium between physical security and divine favor, the Senate guided the popular assemblies to choose Ancus Marcius as Rome's 4th king. Ancus was the grandson of the revered Numa Pompilius, and his character represented a deliberate, highly calculated return to the ancestral values of structural piety and domestic order. Upon receiving the royal fasces, his very first public act was to command the Pontifex Maximus to copy Numa's sacred ritual notebooks onto large, whitened wooden tablets and display them openly within the forum, allowing every citizen to see the exact legal and religious formulas required to maintain the Pax Diorum. Yet, those neighboring Latin tribes who mistook Ancus's peaceful priestly lineage for geopolitical weakness quickly discovered that the new king possessed all the fierce, unyielding resolve of Romulus when the borders of the state were threatened. The defensive campaigns of Ancus Marcius permanently reshaped the demographic and structural landscape of central Italy. When the Latin clans launched predatory raids into the Roman agricultural plains, believing the grandson of Numa would refuse to fight, Ancus mobilized the legions with absolute tactical precision. He did not merely repulse the raiders, he systematically captured their fortified hill towns, including Ficana, Politorium, and Telenae, and marched their entire populations back to the Tiber, mirroring the grand evolutionary pattern established by his predecessors. Ancus integrated these thousands of conquered peoples directly into the city, settling them within the wide valley between the Aventine and Caelian hills. This massive demographic expansion permanently established the Aventine as a distinctly plebeian stronghold, a sprawling residential district packed with working-class energy, while simultaneously reinforcing the defensive military manpower available to the state. With the rapid growth of the city's population and territory, Ancus turned his architectural genius toward the primary geographic features that dictated Rome's strategic advantage. To secure the vital trading routes moving across the Tiber ford and protect the city from western incursions, he fortified the rugged Janiculum Hill on the opposite bank of the river, transforming it into a heavily garrisoned military outpost. To connect this new defensive fortress directly to the civic heart of Rome, Ancus engineered the Pons Sublicius, the very first bridge to span the broad currents of the Yellow Tiber. Constructed entirely from thick, interlocking beams of solid oak, without a single shard of iron masonry or metal nails, this wooden marvel was designed with a brilliant structural pragmatism. In the event of an overwhelming military invasion from the north, the Roman defenders could systematically dismantle or chop down the entire bridge in a matter of minutes, isolating the city safely behind the natural barrier of the deep river current. The creation of the Pons Sublicius catalyzed an unprecedented commercial transformation, carrying Rome's geopolitical influence far beyond its immediate landward horizons. Recognizing that the river was a highway to the western sea, Ancus Marcius marched his legions westward along its path, conquering the ancient forests that lined the coastal plains and establishing Rome's very first maritime colony at Ostia, located precisely at the mouth of the Tiber River. Ostia was not merely a military garrison, it was designed as a sophisticated logistical hub and commercial gateway. Here, Ancus overseen the construction of extensive salt pans, salinae, along the coastal lagoons, expanding the production of this priceless commodity into a massive, state-controlled industry. The salt harvested at Ostia was systematically transported up the newly cleared river roads to be traded into the interior of the peninsula, turning Rome into the ultimate economic pivot of central Italy. To secure this rapidly expanding maritime wealth and manage the complex influx of foreign merchants, travelers, and goods, Ancus constructed the city's first formal judicial infrastructure. Beneath the eastern slopes of the Capitoline Hill, he excavated the Mamertine prison, a grim, stone-walled subterranean vault designed to hold high-profile state criminals, foreign captives, and political saboteurs before their formal execution. Simultaneously, Ancus formalized the administrative structure of the plebs, recognizing their vital, permanent role in the economic vitality of the state. He established clear, written property laws that guaranteed the common people the right to trade safely within the growing marketplace of the Forum, ensuring that internal class relations remained remarkably stable, even as external commercial fortunes surged. When Ancus Marcius passed away peacefully in the year 616, before Christ, after 24 years of balanced, visionary governance, he left behind a state that had fundamentally outgrown its old continental limitations. Through his unique ability to synthesize the defensive piety of Numa with the expansive military structuralism of Romulus, Ancus had successfully transformed Rome from a powerful regional kingdom into a maritime trade power with its eyes fixed firmly on the wide horizons of the Mediterranean world. The mud huts of the prehistoric dawn were disappearing, replaced by an increasingly dense, sophisticated stone architecture, and the stage was perfectly set for the arrival of foreign dynasties who would bring the brilliant, monumental engineering techniques of the advanced world directly to the banks of the Tiber. The peaceful passing of Ancus Marcius marked the end of the alternate Latin Sabine succession and opened the gates for an ambitious, wealthy dynasty from the north that would fundamentally alter the physical and structural landscape of Rome. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, born Lucumo in the sophisticated Etruscan city of Tarquinia, was a man of immense commercial fortune, but locked out of political advancement in his homeland due to his mixed heritage as the son of a Greek merchant refugee from Corinth. Prompted by the fierce, visionary ambitions of his wife Tanaquil, an aristocratic Etruscan woman deeply skilled in the reading of celestial omens, Lucumo gathered his vast wealth, packed his household goods onto a caravan, and migrated directly to the banks of the Tiber. As their carriage ascended the Janiculum hill, overlooking Rome, an eagle swept down from the sky, gently snatched the cap from Lucumo's head, circled the royal fortress, and replaced it with absolute precision, a spectacular omen that Tanaquil instantly interpreted as a divine sign that her husband was destined to wear the highest crown of the Latin state. Upon entering the city, Lucumo changed his name to Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, using his immense wealth and charismatic eloquence to embed himself deep within the political fabric of the Roman state. He became a trusted advisor and intimate friend to King Ancus Marcius, who ultimately appointed Tarquin as the guardian of his young sons. However, when Ancus passed away, Tarquin executed a brilliant, highly calculated political maneuver. He arranged for the late king's sons to be sent on a distant hunting expedition, stepped before the popular assemblies, and delivered a powerful, populist speech highlighting his own deep administrative experience, devotion to Roman rituals, and willingness to spend his private fortune for the public good. Moved by his arguments, the assemblies enthusiastically elected Tarquin as Rome's fifth king, inaugurating a period of intense Etruscan cultural, architectural, and political influence that would transform the rustic settlement into a monumental regional metropolis. Tarquinius Priscus recognized with an engineer's precision that the primary barrier to Rome's structural unification was the deep, malaria-ridden marshland that lay directly between the residential hill communities. To reclaim this valuable space and construct a permanent civic center, he engineered the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Sewer. This monumental civil works project utilized the advanced Etruscan mastery of the stone arch and the keystone to construct a massive, subterranean vaulted canal lined with heavy blocks of volcanic tufa. The Cloaca Maxima systematically collected the stagnant waters of the valleys and channeled them directly into the fast-flowing current of the Tiber River. This brilliant drainage operation completely dried the low valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, transforming a dangerous, muddy bog into a vast, solid earthen platform that allowed for the creation of the Roman Forum, the permanent heartbeat of public assembly, judicial trials, and commercial trade for the next 1,000 years. With the Forum Valley successfully reclaimed, Tarquin turned his architectural focus toward the entertainment and political organization of the rapidly expanding population. In the long, natural depression between the Palatine and Aventine hills, he cleared the valley floor to establish the Circus Maximus, a massive, tiered racing arena designed explicitly for equestrian events and grand public games, Ludi Romani. Initially constructed with temporary wooden viewing stands and a central dirt spiner, the Circus Maximus could accommodate tens of thousands of cheering citizens, channeling the volatile energy of the masses away from civil factionalism and toward highly regulated, thrilling civic competitions. To match this expanding public infrastructure, Tarquin systematically expanded the Senate, adding 100 new members, chosen from the prominent plebeian and minor patrician clans families, designated as the Patris Minorum Gentium, fathers of the lesser gentes, ensuring their absolute, long-term political loyalty to the Etruscan throne. The grandest, Most spiritually significant of Tarquin's architectural blueprints was the planning and foundation of the monumental temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus atop the rugged cliffs of the Capitoline Hill. Designed to serve as the ultimate, unyielding symbol of Rome's religious hegemony over central Italy, this colossal temple platform required the clearing of ancient, rustic shrines and the excavation of immense stone retaining walls. Tarquin imported master Etruscan craftsmen, including the legendary terracotta sculptor Volker of Veii, to oversee the construction of a three-domed sanctuary, cella, dedicated to the Capitoline triad: Jupiter, the all-powerful, Juno the protector, and Minerva the goddess of wisdom. Though Tarquin would not live to see its final dedication, the massive, deep stone foundations he laid permanently pinned the religious destiny of the state to the heights of the Capitoline Rock. The 38-year reign of Tarquinius Priscus ended in a violent, dramatic collision of dynastic vengeance. The aging sons of Ancus Marcius, who had carried a smouldering hatred for the Etruscan outsider who had usurped their hereditary claim, engineered a desperate assassination plot. They hired two rustic shepherds to stage a loud, frantic dispute outside the royal palace gates in the Forum. When Tarquin commanded the brawlers to enter his private audience chamber to settle their legal grievance, one shepherd distracted the king with a passionate plea, while the other stepped quietly behind the throne, raised a heavy iron woodcutter's axe, and buried it deep into the king's skull. As Tarquin collapsed into his own blood in the year 579 before Christ, the palace doors were instantly bolted by Queen Tanaquil, who recognized that the survival of the dynasty depended on absolute presence of mind in the shadow of regicide. With the blood of Tarquinius Priscus still warm on the palace floor, Queen Tanaquil executed a brilliant political deception that would preserve the Etruscan line and place Rome's most radical social reformer on the throne. She leaned out of a high palace window, overlooking the anxious crowds gathering in the Forum, declaring that the king had merely been stunned by a non-fatal blow and had commanded that his stepson, Servius Tullius, should govern the state until his full recovery. Servius had entered the royal household under extraordinary circumstances. Born to a captive Latin noblewoman taken during the destruction of Corniculum, his childhood was touched by a spectacular omen when his head was seen completely enveloped in a ring of harmless, living flame as he slept in the palace portico. Tanaquil, recognizing his divine destiny, raised him as her own. Servius governed with such steady competence that when Tarquin's death could no longer be concealed, he became Rome's sixth king, not through a formal election by the patrician assemblies, but through the direct support of the Senate and the common people, bypassing the old dynastic mechanics entirely. If Romulus had gathered Rome's people, and Numa had shaped their piety, Servius Tullius gave the state its defining structural anatomy through a complete reconfiguration of citizenship. Until his reign, political power and military obligations were dictated exclusively by bloodline and ethnic origin, leaving the rapidly growing population of wealthy plebeians entirely outside the state apparatus. Servius recognized that this rigid, the aristocratic system was fundamentally unsustainable for a rising regional power. He instituted the census, a massive, statewide administrative operation that mandated every male citizen to report directly to the Campus Martius under penalty of death or enslavement. Each man was required to declare his name, his lineage, the number of his dependents, and an exact valuation of his material property, stripping away the ancient tribal identities to organize the citizen body purely on the cold, mathematical basis of economic wealth. Based on this property valuation, Servius divided the Roman population into 5 distinct financial classes, which were further subdivided into 193 centuries administrative units that served simultaneously as voting blocks in the new Comitia Centuriata, Centuriate Assembly, and structural units in the Mestri, Field Army. The wealthiest citizens, possessing property valued at over 100,000 copper asses, formed Class 1, contributing 82 centuries of heavily armed hoplites equipped with bronze helmets, breastplates, greaves, and large round shields, alongside 18 centuries of elite cavalry, equites, As the property values descended through the classes, the defensive armor became lighter and cheaper, until reaching the proletarii, the propertyless mass who possessed nothing but their own children. The proletarii were grouped into a single century, completely exempt from military service and taxation, rendering them a politically silent base in an assembly where Class 1 and the equites held an absolute voting majority. This brilliant institutional synthesis carried an unyielding, pragmatic logic. It linked political voting power directly to military burden. Servius established the foundational Roman principle that those who had the most material wealth to lose in a foreign invasion should bear the heaviest cost of defending the state, purchasing their political dominance with their own blood on the front line. To accommodate this newly integrated civic structure, Servius expanded the sacred boundary of the city Pomerium to incorporate the Quirinal, Viminal, and Esquiline hills, creating a vast, unified urban envelope. To secure this massive capital, he engineered the Servian Wall, a monumental, defensive circuit constructed from heavy, interlocking blocks of yellowish tufa stone quarried from the nearby Etruscan territories, creating an unyielding physical shield that would protect the city across centuries of regional warfare. To cement Rome's economic and cultural hegemony over the surrounding Latin states, Servius constructed the Great Temple of Diana atop the Aventine Hill. Diana, a deity deeply revered by all Latin communities, was positioned here not as a local Roman goddess, but as the patron of a new pan-Latin diplomatic league centered explicitly on the banks of the Tiber. By convincing the neighboring tribes to contribute funds for the construction and maintenance of this sanctuary, Servius subtly transformed Rome from a powerful military rival into the undisputed cultural and religious capital of the entire region, creating an economic orbit that brought wealth, grain, and foreign artisans continuously into the city's markets. Yet, this relentless empowerment of the plebeian classes and the systemic erosion of traditional patrician privilege earned Servius the deep, smouldering hatred of the ancient aristocratic clans, setting the stage for a tragic domestic horror. His own daughter, Tullia, possessed by a fierce, driving ambition that mirrored Queen Tanaquil's but lacked her nobility, conspired with the king's stepson, Lucius Tarquinius. Tullia murdered her own husband, while Tarquin murdered his wife, allowing the treacherous pair to unite in a blood-stained marriage. In the year 535, before Christ, Tarquin marched into the Forum at the head of an armed gang, walked into the Curia Hostilia, and seated himself arrogantly upon the royal throne. When the aged Servius entered the chamber to confront the usurper, Tarquin seized the old man, dragged him to the steps of the Senate house, and cast him violently down into the street below, where his assassins ran him through with spears. The ultimate sacrilege occurred moments later as Tullia drove her heavy chariot through the deserted streets toward the palace. Her driver recoiled in horror, pulling the reins as he noticed the king's bleeding body lying across the dirt lane. Outraged by his hesitation, Tullia seized the leather whips, lashed the horses, and drove the heavy iron wheels directly over her father's corpse, spattering her garments and carriage with his royal blood. The street was known ever after as the Vicus Sceleratus, the street of crime, and as Servius Tullius's broken body lay in the dirt, the golden age of constitutional reform collapsed completely, introducing a dark winter of absolute tyranny that would push the Roman spirit to its ultimate, explosive threshold. The blood-stained ascension of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, remembered across the centuries as Tarquin the Proud, permanently severed the relationship between the Roman monarchy and the constitutional laws of the state. Tarquin was a ruler who derived his authority not from the traditional election of the centuriate assemblies or the ritual confirmation of the Senate, but from the cold mechanics of military terror, political assassination, and absolute intimidation. Upon seizing the throne, he systematically refused to grant the murdered Servius Tullius a formal royal funeral, executed a sweeping purge of the patrician senators who had remained loyal to his predecessor's constitutional reforms, and surrounded his person with a permanent foreign bodyguard of professional mercenaries. For 25 years, Tarquin ruled Rome with an iron, autocratic arrogance, systematically dismantling the judicial protections of ordinary citizens, bypassing the advisory council of the Senate entirely in matters of foreign diplomacy, and utilizing the state treasury to satisfy his private dynastic ambitions. Yet, despite his systemic domestic tyranny, Tarquin the Proud possessed a brilliant, aggressive understanding of regional geopolitics and monumental architecture. He marched the Roman legions into the southern plains of Latium, capturing the immensely wealthy Volscian city of Suessa Pometia and using the vast spoils of war to finally complete the construction of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus atop the Capitoline Hill, that colossal, deep-founded stone sanctuary planned by his grandfather. To secure the city's internal logistics and agricultural distribution networks, he mobilized the forced labor of the plebeian classes, compelling thousands of common citizens to spend their days in the deep, dark subterranean vaults of the earth, expanding the stone-lined channels of the Cloaca Maxima and constructing the massive, terraced stone foundations for new monumental public buildings. To the outside observer, Rome under the later Tarquins appeared to be an invincible, glittering regional superpower. Its metallic walls were taller than ever. Its marketplaces were packed with exotic Etruscan and Greek luxuries, and its diplomatic hegemony stretched across the entire Latin plain. However, this glittering, monumental veneer concealed a deep, smouldering reservoir of public resentment, structural inequality, and elite patrician fury that required only a single spark to detonate the entire monarchical system. That spark arrived in the winter of the year 509 before Christ, during the military siege of the fortified city of Ardea. While the young princes and noble officers were drinking heavily in the royal military camps, a heated debate arose regarding the virtue, fidelity, and moral character of their respective wives at home. To settle the dispute, the young aristocrats mounted their horses and rode swiftly back to Rome under the cover of night to catch their wives unawares. While the royal daughters-in-law were discovered indulging in an ostentatious, luxurious banquet surrounded by foreign musicians and perfumes, Lucretia, the beautiful and pious wife of the noble Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, was found sitting quietly in the simple atrium of her home, spinning wool alongside her domestic maidens by the dim light of an oil lamp, the absolute embodiment of the ancient, uncorrupted Latin virtues. The pristine virtue of Lucretia, rather than inspiring reverence, awakened a dark, predatory malice within the heart of Sextus Tarquinius, the arrogant son of the king. A few nights later, Sextus returned to Collatinus's home alone, drawing upon the sacred laws of traditional hospitality to secure a guest room within the house. In the dead stillness of midnight, when the entire household had fallen into a deep sleep, Sextus slipped into Lucretia's dark chamber, pressed his heavy iron sword against her breast, and threatened to murder her instantly if she raised an alarm. When she courageously refused to yield even to the threat of death, Sextus delivered a calculated, devastating blow to her social honor. He declared that he would slaughter a male slave, place the naked corpse directly beside her in the bed, and inform the entire city that he had executed them both after catching them in an act of low, adulterous dishonor. Trapped in a horrific existential vice where her permanent historical reputation would be utterly destroyed, Lucretia submitted to the prince's violence. The morning following this catastrophic betrayal, Lucretia sent a frantic message to her father and her husband, summoning them to ride instantly to Rome alongside their most trusted political allies. When they arrived at her chamber, accompanied by the brilliant patrician aristocrat Lucius Junius Brutus, Lucretia revealed the horrific details of the prince's crime with an absolute icy clarity. Her family wept, assuring her that the soul alone is guilty, not the physical body when forced by steel. Yet, Lucretia refused to grant herself an easy moral escape. She declared that while she absolved herself of the internal sin, she would never live to see her name utilized as a convenient legal excuse for future unchaste Roman women. Drawing a sharp iron dagger from beneath her heavy robes, she plunged it directly into her own heart, collapsing into her father's arms as her blood pooled across the smooth stone floor of the atrium. The self-execution of Lucretia transformed the patrician witnesses from a state of paralyzed grief into an absolute, unyielding instrument of revolutionary vengeance. Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had spent years playing the role of a slow-witted simpleton to escape the paranoid purges of the king, stepped forward, tore the bloody dagger from Lucretia's chest, and held it high toward the starlit sky. He pronounced a terrifying, binding oath before the heavens, swearing by the sacred blood of this innocent maiden that he would hunt Tarquin the Proud and his entire degenerate lineage from the face of Italy, and that he would never again allow a single man to wield absolute, unchecked, sovereign kingly power within the borders of Rome. The dagger was passed from hand to hand, and each noble patrician swore the exact same unyielding vow, binding their families to a permanent political covenant. Brutus and Collatinus commanded that Lucretia's bleeding body be carried directly out into the crowded public centre of the Forum, exposing the horrific physical evidence of royal tyranny to the eyes of the entire populace. The reaction of the common citizens was instantaneous and explosive. The smouldering resentments of decades of forced labour, arbitrary executions, and the systematic erosion of law crystallized into a single, massive wave of public fury. The popular assemblies gathered in an emergency session on the Comitium, voting enthusiastically to strip Tarquin the Proud of his royal authority, banish his family permanently from the state, and pronounce a permanent curse upon anyone who should ever attempt to re-establish a crown on the Tiber. When the king, receiving news of the rebellion, abandoned his military lines at Ardea and galloped frantically back to Rome, he arrived to find the heavy timber gates of the city barred and bolted against him, his family line permanently severed from the soil they had ruled. In the early spring of the year 509, before Christ, the deep, ancient winter of the monarchy ended forever, and from the ash of tyranny rose a fragile, radical new political structure that would call itself the Republic, an architecture of shared power, written law, and unchecked human ambition. The locking of Rome's timber gates against Tarquin the Proud marked the birth of a political experiment that would permanently reconfigure the ancient Mediterranean world. The res publica, the public thing, having sworn an unyielding oath never again to allow a single individual to hold sovereign, unchecked authority, the patrician elite faced the complex task of designing an administrative system that could exercise executive power without reviving the structural tyranny of the crown. The solution they engineered was both brilliant and structurally fragile. In place of a lifelong king, the Romans established the office of the supreme magistracy, initially called praetors but later designated as consuls. The consular office was anchored to two revolutionary constitutional principles that served as defensive shields against autocratic overreach: annuality and collegiality. Two consuls were elected each year by the wealthiest voting blocks of the Comitia Centuriata, their terms strictly limited to a single 12-month cycle. To ensure that executive power could never be concentrated in a single hand, both magistrates held absolute, identical authority over the state's administration and the command of its field legions. Crucially, each consul possessed the legal right of intercession, the absolute power to invalidate any decree, judicial judgment, or military order issued by his colleague by uttering a single word. This dual-headed executive system transformed the absolute command of the old kings into a permanent, dynamic process of political negotiation, checking unchecked ambition through the constant friction of mutual veto. To maintain the continuity of the sacred laws and ensure that the vital rituals established by Numa Pompilius were not neglected in the absence of a king, the Romans detached the religious duties of the monarchy from its political functions. They created a specialized, politically silent priesthood known as the Rex Sacrorum, the king of sacred rites. This priest inherited the formal title of king, but was strictly barred from holding military commands, sitting in political assemblies, or entering the Senate House, rendering the title a hollow, ritual husk designed exclusively to satisfy the spiritual contracts of the heavens. The true executive authority of the state was physically manifested in the imperium, the absolute power to command the legions and enforce capital punishment wielded by the consuls. When walking through the public streets, each consul was escorted by a ceremonial retinue of 12 lictors, specialized attendants who carried the fasces upon their left shoulders. heavy bundles of elm or birch rods, bound tightly together with leather thongs around a bronze axe, symbolizing the state's absolute sovereign power to scourge and execute those who violated the law. The first election under this new constitutional architecture elevated Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the husband of the martyred Lucretia, to the consular chair. However, this initial administration faced an immediate, profound psychological crisis that threatened to dismantle the infant republic from within. Despite his absolute devotion to the revolutionary cause, Collatinus bore the hated name of the Tarquin dynasty, awakening a deep, paranoid suspicion among the common plebeians who feared that his familial bloodline would eventually draw him back toward royal compromise. Recognizing that the stability of the state required a complete, symbolic break with the monarchical past, Brutus stepped before the popular assemblies and delivered a passionate, painful appeal to his colleague, begging him to voluntarily remove the name of Tarquin from the city's records and withdraw into peaceful exile. Moved by the profound gravity of the request and the silent compliance of the Senate, Collatinus resigned his office, packed his household goods, and departed the city, replaced in the consulship by the stern patrician aristocrat Publius Valerius. This domestic exile was merely the prelude to a far more terrifying internal betrayal. Agents loyal to the banished Tarquin the Proud had slipped quietly into Rome, operating from the shadows to recruit a secret network of young patrician conspirators who looked upon the egalitarian structural reforms of the Republic with an elite, aristocratic disdain. Among these wealthy counter-revolutionaries were the two young sons of Brutus himself, Titus and Tiberius, who conspired to murder the consuls under the cover of night and throw open the city gates to the exiled king's mercenary forces. When a domestic slave discovered the written correspondence detailing the plot and revealed it directly to the magistrates, the conspirators were instantly arrested and dragged in chains before the consular tribunal in the crowded forum. The scene that unfolded next established the terrifying, unyielding standard of Roman civic duty. Lucius Junius Brutus sat upon the high ivory curule chair, looking down upon his own children as they knelt in the dirt, their hands bound behind their backs. By the laws of the Republic, the consul held the absolute power of imperium, and the survival of the state demanded an unyielding execution of justice without regard to blood or affection. Brutus did not flinch, nor did he permit his face to betray a single spark of fatherly grief. In a voice of absolute icy clarity, he commanded his lictors to strip his sons, scourge their bare backs with the rods of the fasces, and execute them by decapitation before the eyes of the entire populace. As the heavy bronze axes fell, rolling the heads of his children across the stone floor of the forum, Brutus remained motionless, freezing his personal agony into a permanent monument of revolutionary discipline, proving to every citizen that the law of the Republic was supreme and that the claims of the state were absolute over the private loyalties of the human heart. Having failed to subvert the Republic through domestic treason, Tarquin the Proud turned westward to the powerful Etruscan city-states, convincing King Lars Porsena of Clusium to mobilize his formidable field armies to crush the Latin rebels. The Etruscan advance through the hills of Latium was swift and devastating, routing the initial Roman defensive lines and sending a wave of panicked refugees streaming across the timber spans of the Pons Sublicius into the heart of the capital. As Porsena's heavy vanguard charged down from the heights of the Janiculum, threatening to storm the bridge and enter the undefended city, a single Roman officer named Horatius Cocles executed a desperate, immortal rearguard stand. He commanded his fleeing comrades to systematically chop down and dismantle the oak beams of the bridge behind him with axes and fire, while he stepped forward alone to confront the entire Etruscan army at the western threshold of the river crossing. Horatius stood upon the narrow wooden span, his large bronze shield catching a rain of Etruscan javelins, his defiant shouts mocking the enemy chieftains as the slaves of tyrants. For long, breathless minutes, his solitary, unyielding presence checked the momentum of the entire invasion, until a massive crash echoed across the river as the final timber beams of the Pons Sublicius collapsed violently into the yellow current. With the bridge completely severed and his city saved, Horatius, despite being heavily wounded and weighed down by his bronze armor, uttered a short prayer to the Tiber River, leaped directly into the fast-flowing water, and swam courageously through a hail of enemy arrows to reach the safe bank of his comrades, a spectacular display of individual willpower that permanently defined the concept of virtus for generations of Roman youth. Though checked at the river, Lars Porsena systematically invested Rome in a long, strangling military siege, cutting off the grain shipments from the coast and plunging the crowded tenements into a winter of desperate famine. In the midst of this starvation, a young patrician named Mucius Scaevola volunteered for a suicide mission to assassinate the Etruscan king within his own lines. Disguised in Etruscan attire, Mucius slipped into the royal military pavilions, but accidentally assassinated the king's heavily robed secretary instead of Porsena himself. Instantly seized by the royal bodyguards, Mucius was dragged before the king, who threatened to burn him alive over a brazier of hot coals if he did not reveal the secrets of the Roman defensive strategy. Mucius, displaying an absolute terrifying detachment from physical pain, replied that the body was nothing compared to the internal honor of a free citizen. He thrust his right hand directly into the living flames of the altar fire, holding it perfectly still, without a single sigh or contraction of his facial muscles, as the skin and flesh turned completely to black ash. He informed the stunned king that 300 young Roman aristocrats had sworn an identical, binding oath to hunt Porsena down, and that he was merely the first to fail. Terrified by an enemy that treated its own flesh with such administrative coldness, Lars Porsena commanded that Mucius be set free, abandoned his alliance with the Tarquins, and withdrew his armies from the Tiber, leaving Rome scarred, starved, but completely master of her own sovereign destiny. The external military victories over the Etruscans did not bring structural peace to the young republic. Instead, they exposed a deep, rotting economic fracture inside the city walls. While the patrician aristocrats expanded their private fortunes and dominated the high consular chairs, the common plebeians, who formed the absolute backbone of the heavy infantry legions, returned from long military campaigns to find their small ancestral farms ruined by neglect or scorched by border raids. Lacking financial capital to buy grain and tools, thousands of common soldiers were forced to borrow funds from wealthy patrician landowners. Under the harsh, unyielding legal code of the early republic, if a debtor failed to repay his loans with exact mathematical precision, his creditor could exercise the right of nexum, a legal contract that allowed the patrician to arrest the debtor, drag him in chains to a private dungeon, subject him to regular physical scourging, or sell his body into absolute debt bondage. The smouldering public outrage reached an absolute breaking point in the year 494 before Christ. While the volatile Volscian and Sabine tribes mobilized their armies on the distant frontiers, an aged, emaciated Roman soldier, broken by debt, slipped from his patrician's prison and rushed into the crowded center of the forum. Clothed in rags, his hair and beard wild, his chest scarred by honorable wounds received in battles for the state, his bare back was freshly torn and bleeding from the creditor's whip. He stood before his fellow citizens, shouting that he had fought in 28 campaigns to protect Roman liberty, yet the laws of his own city had reduced him to a slave. The psychological shockwave was instantaneous and explosive. The plebeian soldiers, refusing to obey the frantic military levies issued by the consuls, marched out of the city gates in a highly disciplined, silent column, withdrawing directly to the heights of the Mons Sacer, the sacred mount, 3 miles to the northeast. This first secessio plebis was a revolutionary political invention, a non-violent general strike that completely paralyzed the machinery of the Roman state. By abandoning the city, the plebeians stripped the patricians of their primary labor source and left the borders completely undefended against foreign invasion. Terrified by the sudden structural paralysis, the Senate sent Menenius Agrippa, a charismatic diplomat, to negotiate with the striking soldiers. Standing before the armed plebeian assembly on the Sacred Mount, Agrippa delivered a famous, pragmatic fable, comparing the state to a human body. He argued that the common workers represented the hands and feet that gathered food, while the Senate represented the stomach that seemingly sat idle, consuming the labor of others. Yet, he demonstrated that if the hands and feet refused to work out of hatred for the stomach, the entire body, including the workers themselves, would inevitably starve and perish. Recognizing the economic truth of the metaphor, the plebeians agreed to return to Rome, but only after dictating a revolutionary constitutional treaty that permanently altered the architecture of the state. They demanded the creation of a brand new, highly protected public office chosen exclusively from their own ranks, the tribunus plebis, the tribune of the plebs. Initially numbering 2, but soon expanded to 10, these officials were invested with an extraordinary, unprecedented legal shield. Sacrosanctity. By the laws of the sacred covenant, anyone who laid a violent hand upon a tribune or attempted to interrupt his public business was instantly declared homo sacer, an accursed criminal whose property was confiscated by the state and whom any citizen could lawfully slaughter without trial. The primary instrument of tribunician power was the ius intercessionis, the right of absolute intercession. By standing at the public assemblies and pronouncing a single word veto, meaning I forbid, a tribune could instantly halt any execution, suspend any tax levy, invalidate any judicial sentence, and completely freeze the military recruitment commands issued by the highest consuls, to ensure that the common people always possessed direct access to this defensive shield. The law mandated that a tribune's house could never be locked, day or night, and that he was strictly barred from leaving the city limits for more than 24 hours. This radical counterweight permanently embedded a system of legal negotiation and structural friction into the fabric of the state, ensuring that the patrician elite could never rule by simple dictate, and proving that the resilience of Rome lay in its unique capacity to balance aristocratic authority with popular resistance. The establishment of the tribunician shield provided the common people with a vital defensive mechanism against patrician overreach. But it did not resolve the fundamental structural flaw of early Roman justice. The laws of the state remained unwritten. For decades, the legal code was preserved exclusively within the oral traditions of the patrician pontiffs, who guarded this monopoly with a fierce, aristocratic jealousy. Because the common plebeians could not read the legal formulas or check the precedents, they were routinely subjected to arbitrary judicial judgments, structural discrimination, and unpredictable punishments meted out by magistrates who operated entirely on whim and class interest. Seeking to end this absolute monopoly on legal knowledge, a tribune named Gaius Terentilius Harsa proposed in the year 462 before Christ that a commission be formed to compile a common, written code of law that would bind every citizen equally, regardless of birth or wealth. After nearly a decade of bitter senatorial resistance, political gridlock, and an extensive diplomatic mission sent to Greece to study the laws of Solon, the two orders achieved a radical, temporary, constitutional compromise. In the year 451 before Christ, the regular machinery of the state, including both the consular chairs and the tribunes of the plebes, was completely suspended. In its place, the popular assemblies elected a board of 10 patrician men, designated as the decemviri, who were invested with absolute, unchecked, sovereign authority to govern the city and commit the legal principles of Rome to writing. Led by the stern, ambitious aristocrat Appius Claudius Crassus, this first board executed its duties with an administrative efficiency and political moderation that surprised the entire state. They produced 10 bronze tablets containing clear, concise and transparent legal statutes, which were posted openly on the comitium in the forum for all to see, establishing the city's very first public code of civil justice. However, as the first year drew to a close, the decemviri declared that the code remained structurally incomplete, requiring 2 additional tablets to achieve a perfect constitutional balance. A second board of 10 men was elected for the year 450 before Christ, with Appius Claudius systematically maneuvering to retain his position as the undisputed leader of the commission. This second decemvirate quickly shed its mask of political moderation, revealing an absolute, tyrannical intention to freeze its temporary power into permanent autocracy. The 10 magistrates surrounded themselves with a combined retinue of 120 lictors, entering the forum not with the symbols of civil justice, but with axes fixed permanently inside the fasces, plunging the city into a dark winter of arbitrary executions, confiscations of property, and the total suppression of free public speech. The 2 additional tablets produced by this second board reflected every ounce of their elite reactionary class bias. Most notoriously, the 11th table instituted a strict statutory ban on intermarriage between patricians and plebeians, a rigid legal measure explicitly designed to isolate the aristocratic bloodline and prevent any peaceful social mobility among the wealthy plebeian merchant clans. Yet, the tyranny of the decemviri was not merely codified in bronze, it was written directly across the daily lives of the citizens. Appius Claudius and his colleagues ruled through absolute terror, bypassing the advisory weight of the Senate and systematically ignoring the traditional right of provocatio, the sacred legal privilege that allowed any Roman citizen to appeal a death sentence issued by a magistrate to the full, popular assembly. The catalyst for the ultimate destruction of the decemvirate mirrored the tragic, domestic horrors that had triggered the fall of the monarchy decades earlier. Appius Claudius became obsessed with a beautiful, pious plebeian maiden named Virginia, the daughter of a highly decorated and fiercely loyal centurion named Lucius Virginius, who was currently fighting for the state on the frontier. When Virginia repeatedly rejected the tyrant's advances, Appius engineered a cynical, fraudulent legal stratagem to seize her body through judicial dictate. He commanded one of his political clients, Marcus Claudius, to publicly claim that Virginia was not the freeborn daughter of the centurion, but rather a runaway slave who had been stolen from his household in infancy. Marcus seized the maiden in the forum, dragging her directly before the tribunal, where Appius Claudius himself sat as the absolute, presiding judge. Despite the passionate protests of Virginia's betrothed, the former tribune Lucius Icilius, and the collective outrage of the gathered citizens, Appius Claudius executed his judicial betrayal with absolute coldness. He rejected the family's evidence, refused to wait for her father to return from the military lines, and issued a definitive legal decree granting provisional custody of the maiden to his client until a full trial could be conducted. The message was unmistakable. Virginia was to be delivered directly into the tyrant's palace before the sun went down. However, friends of the family managed to reach the military camp, and Lucius Virginius galloped frantically back to Rome, entering the forum the next morning, his clothes stained with travel dust, his face pale with fury as he led his daughter toward the tribunal. When Appius Claudius, surrounded by his wall of lictors, arrogantly confirmed his judgment, stripping Virginia of her liberty by legal decree, the centurion realized that he could not defeat the mercenary forces of the state through physical force. He turned to the tyrant, calmly asking for permission to speak with his daughter alone for a final moment near the shops of the forum to verify the truth of her lineage. Appius granted the request, and Virginius led his daughter aside, his arm wrapped around her waist. As they reached a butcher's stall near the sacred shrine of Cloacina, the centurion suddenly grabbed a sharp iron knife from the counter, turned to his daughter, and looked into her eyes. In a voice thick with agony, he declared that there was no other way left to preserve her freedom from the tyrant's lust. He plunged the iron blade directly into her breast, held the bloody weapon high toward the tribunal, and cursed Appius Claudius with the absolute vengeance of her innocent blood. The self-execution of Virginia triggered an immediate, explosive revolution that shattered the decemvirate in a single afternoon. Lucius Virginius galloped back to the military camp, carrying the bloody knife to his fellow soldiers, while Icilius raised the populace inside the city walls. The Roman legions, mirroring the brilliant non-violent strategy of their fathers, executed the second secessio plebis in the year 449 before Christ. They abandoned their commanders, marched through the city gates in perfect tactical formation, and withdrew directly to the Aventine Hill and the Sacred Mount, refusing to touch a single weapon until their liberty was restored. The structural paralysis forced the immediate, unconditional collapse of the tyranny. The decemviri resigned their absolute commissions, The traditional magistracies of the consuls and sacrosanct tribunes were instantly restored, and Appius Claudius was arrested, taking his own life within his dark prison cell before he could face the popular judgment of the people. Yet, the monuments of this dark era remained permanent. The 12 tables were engraved on ivory and bronze plaques and mounted permanently on the rostra in the forum, establishing an unyielding, static legal anchor that stripped away the oral monopolies of the patricians. Though born from tyranny and blood, this common code became the absolute foundation of all subsequent Roman constitutional evolution, an unbending text that proved to every citizen that while empires expand and regimes collapse, the ultimate stability of human life rests upon the transparent majesty of written law. The consolidation of Roman law through the 12 tables and the steady expansion of her territorial grip over neighboring Latin states had given the Republic an aura of local invincibility. For over half a century, Rome had engineered herself into a dominant central Italian power, culminating in the spectacular, grueling 10-year siege and ultimate destruction of the wealthy Etruscan city of Veii by the dictator Marcus Furius Camillus in the year 396 before Christ. This monumental victory doubled Rome's public land and signaled to the entire peninsula that the city on the Tiber was transitioning from a defensive alliance into an aggressive regional superpower. Yet, at the very moment when the patricians and plebeians began to look upon their stone temples and expanded borders with an absolute, unchecked pride, a terrifying, elemental storm was gathering far beyond the northern horizon, a sudden, cataclysmic threat that would push the infant republic to the thin threshold of absolute extinction. From the dark, unknown forests beyond the Alps, a massive, dynamic migration of Senones Gauls, led by their fierce, towering chieftain Brennus, swept down into the fertile plains of the Po Valley. These northern warriors represented an entirely different structural template of warfare to the Mediterranean states. They did not fight in the rigid, calculated phalanxes of the Greeks or the disciplined, mathematical formations of the early Roman hoplites. The Gauls were individuals of immense physical stature, their long, wild hair dyed with lime, their bodies decorated with heavy gold torques and intricate tattoos, wielding massive iron longswords that smashed through bronze armor with a terrifying kinetic ferocity. Moving southward with an aggressive, unstoppable momentum, they invested the Etruscan city of Clusium, prompting the terrified inhabitants to appeal desperately to Rome for diplomatic intervention. The Senate sent 3 noble ambassadors from the patrician Fabia gens to negotiate a peaceful settlement within the Gallic lines. However, these young Roman aristocrats executed their diplomatic commission with an absolute, arrogant disdain for international protocol. During a sudden skirmish outside the city walls, one of the Fabii ambassadors drew his weapon and ran through a prominent Gallic chieftain, stripping the corpse of its armor before the eyes of the enemy lines. When Brennus discovered that the sacred laws of diplomatic neutrality had been violently shattered by the Roman envoys, he instantly called a halt to the siege of Clusium. Turning his entire horde southward toward the Tiber, his warriors marched with a singular, terrifying battle cry echoing through the valley. To Rome. The two forces collided on the 18th of July in the year 390 before Christ at the confluence of the Tiber and the small river Allia, a mere 11 miles north of the capital. The Roman military command, treating the barbarian advance with a fatal, casual condescension, mobilized a hasty levy of 24,000 citizen soldiers, drawing their lines across the plain without constructing a secure military camp or consulting the sacred omens with the proper ritual precision. The encounter was instantaneous and catastrophic, as the Gallic vanguard charged, uttering deafening, guttural war cries that shattered the nerves of the young Roman recruits. Their massive longswords systematically sheared through the light wooden shields and bronze helmets of the legions. The Roman flanks collapsed in absolute panic. Thousands of soldiers were cut down where they stood, while others drowned in their heavy armor as they attempted to swim across the deep current of the Tiber to seek safety. The disaster at the river Allia left the city of Rome completely defensible and paralyzed by fear. As the broken remnants of the army fled westward to the ruins of Veii, the terrified populace inside the capital abandoned their homes, streaming out of the southern gates in a frantic, disorganized exodus. The Vestal virgins hurriedly gathered the eternal fire of Vesta and the sacred celestial talismans of the state, burying them in secret locations before fleeing toward K-Ray. However, a small, highly disciplined garrison of patrician youths, led by the noble warrior Marcus Manlius, refused to yield the sacred memory of the state. They climbed the steep, rocky cliffs of the Capitoline Hill, barricading themselves inside the monumental temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, with the city's remaining weapons and grain reserves, determined to defend the historic citadel to their final breath. When Brennus and his victorious horde marched through the open, unbolted gates of Rome 3 days after the battle, they entered a silent, ghost city painted in the pale shadows of twilight. The Gauls moved through the deserted streets with a deep, cautious suspicion, eventually arriving at the vast platform of the Forum. There, sitting in absolute stillness on the ivory curule chairs in the porches of their homes, sat the aged patrician senators and priests who had refused to abandon their city. Clothed in their magnificent, purple-bordered togas, their long white beards flowing over their chests, they held their ivory staffs in their hands, sitting as motionless and silent as marble statues. For long minutes, the barbarian warriors stood transfixed by this spectacular, eerie display of aristocratic discipline, unsure if they were looking upon living men or ancient gods. The fragile silence was shattered when a curious Gallic warrior stepped forward, stretched out his rough hand, and gently stroked the long beard of Marcus Papirius, a venerable patrician priest. Outraged by this unritualized physical contact, Papirius raised his ivory staff and struck the warrior sharply across his head. The response was instantaneous and brutal. The Gaul drew his sword and slaughtered the old man where he sat, sparking a sudden, savage wave of carnage that swept across the entire Forum. The Gauls systematically set fire to the crowded tenements of the residential hills, plundered the private treasures of the patrician villas, and reduced the historic Curia Hostilia and the monuments of the early Republic to piles of blackened stone and smoking ash. The eternal city lay entirely desecrated beneath the conqueror's tread, its grand destiny seemingly choked in a canopy of soot and blood. For months, the Gallic forces invested the Capitoline stronghold in a long, grueling military siege, but the vertical cliffs of the Tufa Rock defied their static assaults. One moonless night, the barbarians discovered a narrow, hidden pathway leading up the cliff face near the shrine of Carmenta, where a secret Roman messenger had successfully scaled the rock. Moving with absolute, silent precision, a chosen vanguard of Gallic warriors climbed the steep precipice, evading the exhausted Roman sentries and the half-starved watchdogs at the summit without raising a single alarm. They reached the very lip of the citadel's defensive wall, their hands gripping the stone parapets as they prepared to launch a sudden, apocalyptic massacre upon the sleeping garrison. The ultimate survival of Rome hung upon the absolute, auditory sensitivity of a flock of sacred geese. Kept inside the precinct of the Temple of Juno even in the midst of extreme starvation, these birds noticed the soft, subterranean vibrations of the enemy's advance. They suddenly burst into a frantic flurry of wings and loud, piercing honks that instantly awakened Marcus Manlius. Roaring a battle cry to his comrades, Manlius grabbed his sword, ran to the wall, and used the heavy rim of his bronze shield to smash the first Gallic warrior back over the cliff face, dragging the entire climbing column down into the dark abyss below. The garrison rallied, the stronghold was secured, and the sacred geese of Juno were honored ever after in Roman memory as the ultimate savior of the state's sovereignty. Battered by the fierce defensive resistance, running low on supplies, and struck down by a wasting pestilence that flourished in the tight, smoke-filled ruins of the city, Brennus agreed to enter into formal negotiations with the besieged senators. The two parties concluded a bitter, pragmatic treaty. The Gauls agreed to completely evacuate the territory of Latium in exchange for an immediate ransom of 1,000 pounds of solid gold. The gold was brought to the Forum, and the scales were set up in the midst of the ash. However, as the Roman magistrates began to balance the gold coins, they noticed that the Gallic warriors were using fraudulent, heavily weighted counterweights, to cheat the mathematical balance of the transaction. When the Roman tribune Quintus Sulpicius loudly protested this open violation of judicial contract, Chieftain Brennus uttered a deep, cynical laugh. He unbuckled his massive iron longsword, threw the heavy weapon and its heavy bronze scabbard directly onto the scale, along with the counterweights, and looked down upon the defeated senators with an absolute, terrifying clarity. He pronounced the words that would burn themselves permanently into the pride of every subsequent generation of Roman youth. Vae victis, woe to the vanquished. The humiliation seared across Roman consciousness like a permanent scar. At that precise moment, according to later patriotic traditions, the exiled dictator Marcus Furius Camillus suddenly entered the forum at the head of a massive relief army gathered from the Latin allies. He ordered the gold removed from the scales, declaring that true Romans reclaim their fatherland not with gold, but with iron steel, non oro, sed ferro. Though the historical accuracy of Camillus's sudden intervention remains a matter of deep, scholarly debate, the material reality of the year 390 before Christ was absolute. Rome had been burned, humiliated, and reduced to a broken geographic ruin. Yet, the Gauls made a fatal structural mistake. They took the gold, but they left behind the human resource of the state. The city arose from its ashes with an unyielding, paranoid resolve that defeat would never again define its destiny, a vow that would propel the legions into centuries of relentless discipline, technological military revolution, and structural expansion across the entire peninsula. The black smoke of the Gallic invasion eventually cleared from the valleys of the Seven Hills, but the mental scar it left behind remained deeply etched into the Roman consciousness. The Republic had survived its hour of near extinction, but it emerged from the ruin with a cold, architectural paranoia. Never again would the gates of the city be left vulnerable. Never again would a Roman army march to the front lines without an absolute, systematic preparation. As the city rebuilt its temples with heavier stone and fortified its outer perimeter with the massive tufa blocks of the Servian wall, the military commanders realized that the old, rigid hoplite phalanx, inherited from the Greeks and Etruscans, a dense, unyielding wall of spears that required flat, open ground to function, was fundamentally obsolete for the complex regional conflicts that lay ahead. This hard military lesson would be tested to its absolute limit, as Rome's expanding geopolitical interests pushed her legions away from the coastal plains of Latium and directly into the rugged, limestone peaks of the Apennine Mountains, where a fierce confederation of hill tribes known as the Samnites waited to contest the sovereignty of central Italy. The Samnites were a people whose cultural template was completely antithetical to the urban, legalistic structure of the Roman Republic. They were pastoral highlanders, organized into loose clans that lived in unfortified mountain villages, their youths hardened from infancy by the brutal winters, rocky terrain, and a lifelong devotion to predatory guerrilla warfare. They did not wear the heavy, cumbersome bronze armor of the lowlands. Instead, they equipped themselves with light, flexible leather breastplates, large rectangular shields, scuta, and devastating javelins, pila, designed to shatter enemy shield walls before engaging in close-quarters combat with short, broad swords. When the wealthy, sophisticated Greek and Oscan cities of the Campanian plain, including Capua, appealed to Rome for protection against the relentless mountain raids of these highlanders, the Senate executed a series of diplomatic treaties that instantly sparked the Samnite Wars, a bitter, shifting, 50-year existential struggle, stretching from 343 to 290 before Christ that would systematically determine who ruled the Italian peninsula. The ultimate crisis of this mountain conflict occurred in the summer of the year 321 before Christ, during the Second Samnite War. The Roman consuls, Titus Veturius Calvinus and Spurius Postumius Albinus, led a massive field army of 40,000 citizen soldiers into the rugged mountain passes of Samnium, pursuing a false rumor spread by Samnite scouts that Luceria was under immediate siege. As the long, heavily laden Roman columns marched deep into the narrow valley known as the Caudine Forks, bordered on both sides by steep, impassable limestone cliffs and dense forests, they suddenly discovered that the far exit of the pass had been completely blocked by a massive barricade of felled oak trees, boulders, and armed Samnite warriors. Turning back in a sudden panic toward the entrance of the gorge, the consuls found that the path behind them had been identical, locked by a secondary Samnite blocking force under the command of their brilliant general, Gavius Pontius. Trapped in a horizontal vice of stone and steel, without a single drop of fresh water or room to deploy their heavy lines, the Roman legions were completely paralyzed. Rather than executing a bloody slaughter of the trapped army, Gavius Pontius listened to the cold diplomatic counsel of his father, Herennius, who argued that they should either execute every Roman soldier to break the state's military manpower for a generation, or set them free, completely unhurt, to buy a permanent, fraternal peace with the Republic. Pontius chose a fatal middle path of absolute political humiliation. He forced the two consuls to sign a deeply disadvantageous peace treaty, stripped themselves of their vellum armor and purple-bordered robes, and marched the entire 40,000-man Roman army out of the gorge in single file, clothed only in their thin undergarments. Each citizen soldier was forced to bend his back and pass beneath the yoke eugum, a structural crossbeam constructed of 3 enemy spears fixed into the earth, while the Samnite warriors stood along the ridges, shouting insults and mocking the shattered pride of the Republic. The psychological humiliation at the Codine Forks seared into the Roman soul like an iron brand. When the defeated legions slunk back into the city under the cover of night, refusing to look upon their families, the Senate instantly rejected the peace treaty signed by the consuls, declaring that no contract was valid without the formal approval of the popular assemblies. But the Romans did not merely seek revenge. They executed a profound, systematic, structural overhaul of their entire military apparatus. Shedding the ancient hoplite phalanx entirely, the military tribunes engineered the Manipular Legion, a decentralized, highly flexible layout designed specifically for rapid movement across broken, mountainous terrain. The old, massive wall of spears was broken down into 30 independent tactical blocks called maniples, literally handfuls, arranged across the battlefield in a shifting, 3-tiered checkerboard pattern known as the quincunx. The first line consisted of the hastati, the youngest and most eager recruits. Behind them stood the principes, men in the absolute prime of life and fully armored, while the final line was formed by the triarii, veteran warriors of unyielding discipline who carried heavy spears to serve as a final anchor if the front lines faltered. This checkerboard geometry allowed the independent maniples to advance, retreat, or twist through mountain ravines without breaking the cohesion of the army. If a frontline maniple faced overwhelming pressure, it could quietly withdraw into the open spaces left by the line behind it, creating a fluid, breathing machine of war that could absorb structural shocks and adjust its density to match any tactical landscape. Alongside this structural flexibility, the Romans completely systematically copied the superior technology of their enemies. They abandoned the circular round shield to adopt the heavy, curved rectangular scutum of the Samnites, which provided absolute, overlapping coverage from chin to ankle. They replaced their fragile thrusting spears with the pilum, a heavy javelin engineered with a soft iron neck that bent upon impact, preventing the enemy from throwing it back and locking their shields in place with its dead weight. Finally, they adopted the devastating, double-edged short sword of Spain, the gladius hispaniensis, turning the individual legionary into a terrifying, close-quarters combat specialist who advanced behind a wall of wood and iron to execute his enemy with precise, administrative thrusts to the torso. This technological and structural revolution turned the tide of the geopolitical conflict. At the decisive Battle of Sentinum, in the year 295 before Christ, the reformed Roman legions confronted a massive, unprecedented coalition of Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and fierce Senones Gauls who had united in a desperate attempt to halt the expansion of the Republic. When the Roman left wing faltered before the terrifying charge of Gallic war chariots, the consul Publius Decius Mus executed the ultimate sacred ritual of devotio. He stood before his lictors, pronounced a solemn legal formula dedicating his own life and the souls of the enemy army directly to the gods of the underworld, and spurred his horse alone into the thickest mass of Gallic blades. Inspired by this display of individual self-sacrifice, the Roman line stabilized. The veteran maniples executed a perfect flanking maneuver, and the coalition was utterly shattered, leaving 25,000 enemy dead upon the plain. The final submission of Samnium in the year 290 before Christ left Rome as the undisputed master of central and southern Italy. To cement this immense territorial grip, the Republic did not rely on simple garrisons. They engineered a permanent logistical grid across the peninsula. They constructed the Via Appia, the Appian Way, a monumental military highway paved with heavy, interlocking blocks of smooth basalt rock that stitched the capital directly to the rich coastal hubs of Campania and the south. Along these strategic arteries, they established a network of fortified colonies, coloniae, populated by citizen veterans and Latin allies, creating permanent cultural and military outposts that disseminated Roman language, customs, and laws into once foreign spaces. The rustic settlement of huts by the Tiber had completely outgrown its continental limits. It was now a hard, breathing confederation of steel, stone, and law, its legions perfectly sharpened, and its eyes turning steadily toward the clear, wide horizons of the Mediterranean Sea. The submission of the Italian peninsula left the Roman Republic standing at a profound geopolitical threshold. No longer a localized network of agrarian hill towns, Rome was now a continental superpower whose administrative shadow stretched from the Po Valley down to the Greek maritime ports of the southern coast. Yet, as the Roman Senate looked out across the narrow, glittering waters of the Strait of Messina, they confronted a strategic reality that their heavy mountain legions could not reach. Across the Mediterranean basin ruled Carthage, a towering, ancient maritime empire centered on the North African coast, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders. Carthage was the undisputed queen of the western seas. Her massive double harbors at Tunis were crowded with high-prowed merchant vessels. Her state treasuries overflowed with silver, mined from the mountains of Spain, and her naval fleets of swift, heavy quinqueremes enforced an absolute commercial monopoly that closed the western waters to all foreign rivals. Where Rome's power was anchored to the internal steel of citizen-soldier legions and permanent landward alliances, Carthage's strength rested on unmatched naval technology, unimaginable mercantile wealth, and vast, professional mercenary armies recruited from across the ancient world. The spark that detonated the inevitable collision between these two restless titans arrived in the year 264 before Christ, centered on the fertile, highly contested island of Sicily. A rogue mercenary band known as the Mamertines had violently seized the strategic city of Messina, provoking a devastating military intervention from Hero II, the tyrant of Syracuse. Facing immediate destruction, the Mamertines executed a desperate dual diplomacy, appealing simultaneously to Carthage and Rome for military protection. The Carthaginian navy acted with swift, logistical precision, immediately occupying the citadel of Messina and securing a direct foothold just miles from the Italian mainland. Inside the Curia Hostilia, the Roman Senate wavered, deeply torn between the conservative fear of engaging a global maritime superpower and the terrifying realization that if Carthage swallowed Sicily entirely, the southern borders of Italy would be permanently strangled. Moved by a burning populist hunger for military plunder and geopolitical security, the popular assemblies voted to intervene, crossing the strait to drive the Carthaginian garrison from Messina and launching the First Punic War, a brutal, shifting, 24-year maritime struggle that would systematically test the limits of human endurance. The initial land campaigns in Sicily demonstrated the absolute dominance of the Roman Modular Legion, as the consular forces systematically pushed the Carthaginian mercenary lines back into their fortified coastal strongholds. However, the Roman commanders quickly realized that they could never achieve a definitive geopolitical victory so long as Carthage maintained total, absolute mastery of the sea lanes, routinely reinforcing her besieged fortresses by water and raiding the undefended coastal towns of Italy at will. Rome faced a terrifying, existential dilemma. She was an agrarian land animal attempting to defeat a predatory marine beast, possessing no naval traditions, no professional rowers, and no structural understanding of maritime architecture. Undeterred by this absolute technical void, the Senate executed a monumental engineering project, utilizing a single, shipwrecked Carthaginian quinquereme washed up on an Italian beach as an exact blueprint to build a massive war fleet of 120 heavy vessels from scratch in less than 60 days, while thousands of rustic peasants were trained to row in unison on makeshift wooden benches constructed along the dirt shores. Yet, the Roman naval architects knew that their raw, inexperienced crews could never match the fluid, tactical maneuvering of the veteran Carthaginian captains, who specialized in ramming enemy hulls with heavy bronze prows. To neutralize this technological disadvantage, Roman engineers invented a radical, terrifying mechanical apparatus, the corvus, the raven. This was a massive, 36-foot wooden boarding bridge attached to a heavy swiveling mast erected on the prow of every Roman warship. The underside of the bridge was armed with a heavy, curved iron spike shaped like a raven's beak. When a Carthaginian vessel surged alongside a Roman ship to perform a ramming maneuver, the Roman crew released the heavy pulley system, dropping the corvus violently onto the enemy deck. The heavy iron spike instantly pierced the timber planks, locking the two shifting vessels together in an unyielding mechanical grip. This apparatus completely revolutionized ancient naval tactics. It systematically stripped away the value of nautical seamanship, allowing the highly disciplined, heavily armored Roman legionaries to stream across the wooden ramp and turn a fluid sea battle into a brutal, close-quarters infantry engagement, where their sword discipline excelled. The ultimate validation of this technological audacity occurred in the year 260 before Christ at the historic Battle of Mylae off the northern coast of Sicily. The Carthaginian fleet advanced in a loose, arrogant formation, treating the rustic Roman vessels with absolute, open derision. The collision was instantaneous and shocking. As the Carthaginian quinqueremes closed in, the heavy boarding bridges of the corvus crashed down across their decks with administrative precision, locking their elite crews in a vice of iron and bone. The Roman legionaries slaughtered the lightly armed Phoenician marines, capturing 30 ships, sinking 13 others, and securing the Republic's very first major naval triumph. The psychological shockwave rippled across the Mediterranean. The land animal had grown teeth capable of biting through the hulls of the Sea Queen, and the consul Gaius Duilius was honored with Rome's first naval triumph, his monument adorned with the severed bronze rostra of the captured enemy fleet. For more than 2 decades, the war raged across the shifting waters of the western Mediterranean, balancing like a scale of absolute human suffering. At the colossal Battle of Cape Ecnomus in 256, before Christ, perhaps the largest naval engagement in human history, involving over 300,000 men, the Roman fleet hacked its way through the Carthaginian lines, clearing a path for a daring, ill-fated invasion of Africa by the consul Marcus Atilius Regulus. Yet, the sea proved to be a far more savage enemy than Carthage. While the corvus guaranteed victory in battle, its immense top-heavy weight made the Roman warships dangerously unstable in turbulent weather. In the summer of 255, before Christ, a monstrous storm caught the returning fleet off the coast of Camarina, systematically smashing nearly 300 vessels against the rocky cliffs and drowning over 100,000 citizen soldiers in a single afternoon. A catastrophic loss of military manpower that would have broken any other ancient state. Yet, Rome refused to yield. With an absolute, unbending resolve that bordered on madness, the Senate repeatedly taxed its citizens to build fresh fleets, lost them to subsequent storms, and built them anew. The final, exhausting reckoning arrived in the spring of the year 241 before Christ, at the Battle of the Aegates Islands. The Roman wealthy patricians, utilizing their private fortunes to fund one final fleet of 200 streamlined warships without the cumbersome corvus, intercepted a heavily laden, sluggish Carthaginian supply fleet under the command of Hanno. The reformed Roman crews, now hardened by years of naval service, outmaneuvered the Punic vessels with absolute precision, sinking 50 ships and capturing 70 others in a decisive, crushing stroke. Completely bankrupt, her mercenary forces stranded in Sicily under the undefeated general Hamilcar Barca, and her naval capacity utterly broken, Carthage sued for peace. The First Punic War ended with a binding, punitive treaty. Carthage was forced to completely evacuate Sicily and pay an immense tribute of 3,200 talents of solid silver to the Roman treasury. Rome emerged from the long winter of the conflict, permanently transformed. She had broken the Queen of the Waves, stepped across the continental boundary of Italy to establish her very first overseas province in Sicily, and proven to the ancient world that her unyielding willpower could conquer the very oceans. The punitive peace of 241 before Christ did not extinguish the smouldering geopolitical frictions between Rome and Carthage. Instead, it planted the toxic, volatile seeds for a far more devastating existential collision. While the Roman Republic consolidated its hold over Sicily and illegally seized the strategic islands of Sardinia and Corsica, the brilliant Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca led his family line westward into the rugged, silver-rich territory of Spain. There, beneath the heavy shadow of their domestic defeat, the Barcid dynasty constructed a massive, semi-independent military empire, generating immense wealth to refill the Punic state treasuries, and hardening a brand new generation of professional mercenaries in relentless campaigns against the local Iberian tribes. It was in this atmosphere of smouldering dynastic hatred that Hamilcar forced his young son Hannibal to stand before the altar of the sacrificial fires at Carthage and swear a terrifying, lifelong oath that he would never be a friend to Rome, a binding psychological covenant that would eventually unleash a tidal wave of blood and iron across the entire Italian peninsula. The diplomatic spark that detonated the Second Punic War arrived in the year 219 before Christ, centered on the wealthy, fortified coastal city of Saguntum in eastern Spain. Though Saguntum sat safely south of the Ebro River, the formal boundary delineated by earlier treaties between Rome and Hasdrubal, the city had negotiated a secret defensive alliance with the Roman Senate. Hannibal, having assumed absolute military command of the Barcid forces following his father's passing, recognized this alliance as a direct, unacceptable encroachment upon Carthage's sovereign sphere of influence. He systematically invested Saguntum in a brutal, 8-month military siege, ignoring the frantic diplomatic protests of Roman envoys who traveled to his camp. When the city finally fell, its defenders committing collective suicide amid the flames of their own ruins, the Roman Senate delivered an absolute ultimatum to the Carthaginian government: surrender Hannibal Barca instantly, or face open, immediate war. The Carthaginian elders accepted the challenge, and the stage was set for a conflict that would systematically push the Roman Republic to the thin threshold of utter oblivion. The Roman military strategy for the year 218 before Christ was anchored to a traditional, dual-front offensive framework. One consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, was dispatched with a powerful war fleet to strike the Barcid base in Spain, while his colleague, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, mobilized a massive invasion force in Sicily destined for the North African coast to besiege Carthage itself. Hannibal, possessing a brilliant, asymmetric understanding of strategic psychology, completely shattered this conventional calculus through a bold, unprecedented logistical maneuver. He abandoned Spain entirely to his brother Hasdrubal, gathered an immense army of 50,000 veteran infantry, 9,000 elite Numidian cavalry, and 37 formidable war elephants, and launched a sweeping, landward march northward across the Pyrenees and through the wild plains of Gaul, determined to bring the war directly into the undefended backyard of Italy. The defining logistical epic of this strategic movement was the crossing of the snowbound, treacherous passes of the Alps in the late autumn of 218 before Christ. Hannibal's column trudged through narrow, ice-slicked precipices, battered continuously by freezing blizzards, sudden avalanches, and relentless guerrilla ambushes launched by hostile mountain tribes who rolled massive boulders down from the heights into the crowded Punic ranks, Pack mules lost their footing, sliding into the dark abysses below, while the heavy elephants struggled through drifts of frozen snow, their limbs cracked by the extreme drop in temperature. When a massive rockslide completely blocked a vital mountain path, Hannibal ordered his exhausted engineers to construct immense fires against the stone, dousing the white-hot rock with sour wine to crack it into manageable fragments. When the Punic vanguard finally descended into the fertile Po Valley of northern Italy, Hannibal had lost over half his army to the elements, yet his presence was an absolute strategic shockwave that completely paralyzed the Roman Senate, forcing them to recall their invasion forces from Sicily to defend the homeland. Hannibal immediately demonstrated his absolute tactical superiority over the conservative Roman consuls in a sequence of devastating engagements in northern Italy. At the river Ticinus, his highly mobile, elite Numidian cavalry outflanked and routed the Roman horsemen, severely wounding the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who was only saved from execution by the spectacular, courageous intervention of his teenage son, the future Scipio Africanus. Weeks later, at the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal utilized a brilliant psychological manipulation. He launched a simulated cavalry raid at dawn to draw the second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, across the freezing, chest-deep waters of the river before the Roman soldiers had eaten breakfast. Numbed by the cold and blinded by a sudden snowstorm, the Roman legions marched directly into a meticulously prepared tactical trap. Hannibal's brother Mago, hidden in a deep, marshy ravine with 2,000 chosen warriors, burst upon the Roman rear, while the elite Punic infantry crushed their flanks, leaving over 20,000 Roman dead in the freezing mud. The following spring, in the year 217 before Christ, Hannibal executed an even more terrifying tactical maneuver. He marched his army through the supposedly impassable, flooded marshes of the Arno River for 4 straight days and nights, his soldiers sleeping on the bloated corpses of dead baggage animals to escape the rising waters, with Hannibal himself, losing an eye to a severe ophthalmic infection, emerging into the hills of Etruria. He systematically laid bait for the arrogant, populist consul Gaius Flaminius, burning the rich agricultural estates of the region to provoke an immediate, emotional pursuit. On a foggy morning along the shores of Lake Trasimene, Flaminius led his long columns into a narrow road, bordered on one side by steep, wooded hills, and on the other by the deep waters of the lake, without sending scouts ahead to verify the safety of the pass. The trap at Lake Trasimene was the largest, most perfectly executed military ambush in human history. At a single horn signal from Hannibal, the entire Carthaginian army charged down from the foggy heights simultaneously, striking the Roman column from the flank before the legions could deploy their shields or unpack their weapons. The slaughter was absolute and industrial. For 3 hours, the Punic mercenaries hacked through the panicked, disorganized Roman lines. Gaius Flaminius was run through by an Insubrian horseman, and 15,000 Roman citizen soldiers were systematically slaughtered where they stood, while thousands of others drowned as they fled blindly into the cold waters of the lake. When news of the disaster reached the capital, the praetor stepped onto the comitium before the weeping crowds and pronounced a stark, unritualized sentence that shattered the ancient pride of the state. Pugna magna victi sumus. We have been defeated in a great battle. In this hour of supreme existential crisis, the Roman Senate bypassed the traditional consular elections to appoint a veteran aristocrat, Quintus Fabius Maximus, as absolute dictator. Fabius recognized with a clinical clarity that Hannibal was a military genius who could never be defeated in a direct, static pitch battle on Italian soil. He engineered a radical, deeply unpopular war strategy known ever after as the Fabian strategy. He strictly refused to engage Hannibal's main force, choosing instead to shadow the Punic army from the safety of the rugged hilltops, systematically cutting off his foraging parties, harassing his supply lines, and exhausting his mercenary resources through a grueling war of attrition. While the common populace and hot-headed politicians mocked Fabius as the cunctator the delayer, accusing his cautious methods of cowardice, as Hannibal systematically burned the rich farmlands of Apulia, Fabius's discipline bought the Republic a vital winter of structural respiration, allowing the state to rebuild its shattered legions and gather its human resources for one final, supreme test of strength. The ultimate, catastrophic reckoning arrived in the summer of the year 216 before Christ. The Fabian dictatorship having expired, the Roman popular assemblies, burning with a frantic desire to wipe the Punic threat from the peninsula in a single afternoon, elected two new consuls, the cautious, patrician Lucius Aemilius Paulus and the arrogant, populist demagogue Gaius Terentius Varro. Together, they mobilized the largest single-field army the Republic had ever brought to a single battlefield. 8 massive legions, encompassing over 80,000 highly disciplined citizen soldiers and allied infantry. They marched into the scorching plains of Apulia, drawing their immense lines along the banks of the Aufidus River near the fortified village of Cannae, determined to overwhelm Hannibal's 40,000-man force through the sheer, crushing mass of their heavy infantry formations. The Battle of Cannae, fought on the 2nd of August in 216 before Christ, represents the ultimate masterpiece of tactical architecture in the history of global warfare. Varro, holding absolute command for the day under the alternating system, packed his 60,000 heavy infantry legionaries into an extraordinarily dense, narrow formation, intending to drive through the center of the Carthaginian line like a massive iron ram. Hannibal, anticipating this precise movement, deployed his army in an intentional, highly unusual crescent formation that bulged outward toward the Roman line, placing his weakest Gallic and Spanish infantry in the bowing center while anchoring his flanks with his elite, heavily armored African veterans. As the massive Roman column advanced, their heavy shields smashing into the Punic center, Hannibal's Gallic infantry executed a calculated fighting retreat, allowing the crescent to slowly buckle and invert inward under the immense pressure. This controlled collapse drew the dense Roman column deep into a structural pocket of death. While the legions continued to press forward, believing they were on the lip of a total breakthrough, Hannibal's elite African flanks remained completely stationary, forming 2 rigid, immovable walls of iron on either side of the advancing Romans. Simultaneously, the brilliant Punic cavalry under Hasdrubal utterly routed the Roman horsemen on the wings, swept around the rear of the battlefield, and smashed directly into the back of the heavy infantry column. The encirclement was absolute. The 80,000-man Roman army was compressed into a frantic, paralyzed mass of bone and iron so dense that individual soldiers could no longer raise their arms to draw their short swords or turn their shields to parry the blows. The slaughter that followed lasted until the sun went down across the dust of Apulia. For hours, the Punic mercenaries hacked systematically into the trapped, defenseless mass of the legions at an industrial rate of nearly 100 human lives per minute. The consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, was struck down by a heavy stone sling, dying amid the wreckage of his horsemen. 80 senators, 29 military tribunes, and nearly 70,000 Roman citizen soldiers were slaughtered in a single afternoon, their golden equestrian rings stripped from their cold fingers and sent in massive baskets to Carthage as a monument of victory. Terentius Varro fled the field with a handful of horsemen, leaving the Republic completely stripped of its military manpower, its treasuries bankrupt, its elite political class decimated, and its oldest allies in the south defecting instantly to the enemy. As the shadow of midnight settled over the blood-soaked field of Cannae, the ultimate survival of Rome seemed utterly broken, her eternal destiny choked in the dust of her greatest military catastrophe. The catastrophic slaughter at Cannae left the Roman Republic entirely stripped of its traditional military defenses, its elite ruling class decimated, and its treasury utterly bankrupt. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the southern gate of Rome stood completely unbolted, and the path from the plains of Apulia to the banks of the Tiber lay open, vulnerable, and undefended. In the camps of the victorious Carthaginian army, Hannibal's brilliant cavalry commander, Maharbal, urged his general to march their forces directly upon the capital, without a single moment's delay, declaring that within 5 days, Hannibal would dine in triumph atop the Capitoline hill. Yet, Hannibal wavered, recognizing that his exhausted mercenaries lacked the heavy siege machinery required to breach the massive stone fortifications of the Servian wall, and choosing instead to pursue a long, diplomatic strategy of isolating Rome from her allied confederation, Mahabal, turning away in deep frustration, pronounced a chilling judgment that would echo through the subsequent centuries of global military history. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use it. Inside the walls of Rome, the panic that followed the initial reports of Cannae was quickly mastered by an absolute, terrifying manifestation of senatorial discipline. The Senate, led by the iron resolve of the aging patrician aristocrat Quintus Fabius Maximus, completely banned the word peace within the borders of the city, prohibited public weeping in the streets, and mandated a strict winter of absolute domestic austerity. To rebuild the state's shattered military manpower, the magistrates executed a series of radical, unprecedented structural measures. They lowered the minimum age of enlistment, drafted young boys from the schools, and purchased 8,000 young, athletic slaves from private households at public expense, freeing them from their bonds and arming them with the ancient bronze shields and iron weapons stored in the temples as sacred relics. When the defeated consul Terentius Varro slunk back into the city after fleeing the slaughter, the entire Senate marched out to the gates to meet him, delivering a profound public thank you because he had not despaired of the Republic's ultimate survival, a magnificent display of aristocratic solidarity that completely checked the spread of public panic. The Senate immediately reinstated the Fabian strategy across the entire Italian peninsula, transforming the geopolitical conflict from a series of grand pitch battles into a grueling, decentralized war of absolute attrition. Rome raised 25 fresh legions from her remaining human resources, instructing her commanders to shadow Hannibal's movements from the safety of the rugged hilltops, systematically cutting off his foraging parties, starving his garrisons, and preventing him from consolidating his grip over the deflecting cities of the south. If Hannibal marched north, the Romans withdrew into their fortified mountain enclaves. If he marched south, they descended to punish the rebellious towns that had betrayed the Republic. This strategy required an immense, almost unimaginable standard of human endurance from the citizen soldiers, who spent years sleeping in muddy trenches on the cold ridges, their small ancestral farms at home falling into absolute ruin, yet their internal steel remaining completely unbroken. The war soon expanded into a multi-front Mediterranean conflagration centered on the wealthy, strategically vital island of Sicily. Following the passing of the loyal old tyrant Hiero II, the brilliant maritime city of Syracuse executed a sudden diplomatic betrayal, casting off its long-standing alliance with Rome to throw open its double harbors to a powerful Carthaginian naval garrison. Recognizing that the loss of Syracuse would permanently slice the logistical throat of the Republic, the Senate dispatched the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a warrior known as the Sword of Rome due to his fierce, aggressive martial character, at the head of a massive land and naval invasion force to systematically reduce the rebellious metropolis to ash. Marcellus invested Syracuse in the winter of 214 before Christ, drawing his massive war fleet directly under the sea walls of the city, confident that his heavy mechanical battering rams and floating siege towers would force a total breakthrough in a matter of days. However, the Roman assault immediately collided with the unmatched, world-shattering engineering genius of a single human mind, the legendary mathematician and philosopher Archimedes. Archimedes transformed the entire seawall of Syracuse into a terrifying, highly automated barrier of mechanical destruction. When the Roman quinquiremes approached the stone walls, Archimedes deployed massive, counterweighted cranes that extended far over the masonry. These cranes dropped heavy iron hooks and claws that latched onto the prows of the warships, lifting the massive vessels completely out of the water before dropping them violently back onto the jagged rocks below, shattering the timbers and drowning the crews in a matter of minutes. Simultaneously, he engineered sophisticated, adjustable catapults that launched massive boulders and barrels of burning pitch into the Roman lines with an absolute mathematical precision, while popular legends through the centuries whispered that he constructed a magnificent array of polished bronze mirrors that focused the blinding rays of the Mediterranean sun to set the sails of the enemy ships ablaze from a proper distance. Marcellus, realizing that his conventional siege architecture was completely useless against the scientific defenses of Archimedes, was forced to call a complete halt to his frontal assaults, converting the operation into a long, suffocating land and sea blockade that lasted for 2 agonizing years. The ultimate breakthrough arrived in the spring of 212 before Christ, during a night of grand public celebration within the city walls in honor of the goddess Artemis. While the Syracusan defenders were heavily intoxicated on wine and completely distracted by the festivities, a chosen vanguard of Roman legionaries scaled a vulnerable, unguarded segment of the northern wall under the cover of midnight, killed the sentries, and threw open the massive bronze gates to Marcellus's veterans. The sack of Syracuse was a savage, chaotic explosion of military fury. The Roman soldiers plundered the ancient treasures of the palaces and markets, bringing an immense hoard of fine Greek art and scientific scrolls back to the Tiber to forever alter the cultural landscape of the capital. Amid the chaos of the sack, the tragic death of Archimedes served as a permanent monument to the collision between abstract intellect and raw military structuralism. According to ancient sources, a single Roman legionary burst into the philosopher's private study, finding the old man kneeling on the floor, completely absorbed in sketching complex geometric diagrams in the smooth sand. Archimedes, barely looking up from his calculations, gently waved his hand and commanded the soldier not to disturb his circles. Enraged by this absolute indifference to his military authority, the unlettered legionary drew his short gladius and ran the ancient mathematician through with a single thrust, bringing a violent end to the greatest scientific light of the ancient world. Marcellus deeply mourned the loss of Archimedes, ordering a magnificent public funeral for the philosopher and ensuring that his family line was protected from future harm. While Syracuse fell in the south, the main theatre of war in Italy reached an absolute psychological climax in the year 211 before Christ, centered on the critical city of Capua. Capua had been the wealthiest Italian city to defect to Hannibal following Cannae, and the Roman Senate was determined to make its punishment a permanent warning to every other ally on the peninsula. 6 Roman legions systematically encircled Capua, constructing an immense double ring of trenches and wooden palisades to cut off all food and communication from the outside world. Hannibal, realizing his primary ally was on the lip of complete starvation, marched his main army directly toward Capua, but found the Roman fortifications too deep and rigid to breach. In a desperate final attempt to force the consuls to break their lines, Hannibal executed a bold, asymmetric tactical feint. He abandoned Capua, marched his veteran mercenaries swiftly northward along the Via Latina, and pitched his tents just 3 miles outside the gates of Rome itself, his cavalry riding right up to the walls to throw javelins over the masonry. The cry of Hannibal ad portas Hannibal is, at the gates, echoed through the crowded tenements of the 7 hills, triggering a wave of intense anxiety among the women and children. Yet, the Senate displayed an absolute, almost magnificent coldness in the face of the ultimate terror. They refused to recall a single legion from the siege of Capua, relying on their domestic reserves to man the Servian wall. To demonstrate their absolute certainty of survival to the enemy, the Romans put the very plot of land where Hannibal had pitched his military tent up for public auction inside the city, and the land was purchased by a patrician bidder for its full, undepreciated pre-war market value. Defeated by this display of psychological steel, running low on supplies, and realizing that he could not capture the capital without a massive siege train, Hannibal turned away from the walls in deep frustration, withdrawing his forces into the south. Capua fell to the consuls days later. Its noble leaders were systematically executed, its common citizens sold into absolute slavery, and its entire municipal government abolished, a stark, unyielding lesson that proved to the entire peninsula that while Hannibal could win spectacular victories, the long, grinding steel of Rome would inevitably punish those who abandoned the Republic. While the Italian peninsula remained locked in an exhausting war of attrition. The Roman Senate recognized that they could never achieve a definitive geopolitical victory over Carthage as long as the Iberian Peninsula remained an open, thriving logistical pipeline for the Barcid dynasty. Spain was the deep heart of the Carthaginian war machine. Its rich silver mines at Carthago Nova poured unimaginable wealth into the Punic treasuries. Its fertile plains provided vast agricultural supplies to sustain mercenary forces, and its fierce tribal populations offered an inexhaustible reservoir of raw military manpower. For years, Scipio's father, Publius Cornelius Scipio, and his uncle, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, had fought a brilliant but precarious campaign in Spain to check this pipeline. However, in the dark winter of 211 before Christ, both elder Scipios were outmaneuvered, defeated, and executed in separate engagements by the three Carthaginian generals on the peninsula, Hasdrubal Barca, Mago Barca, and Hasdrubal Gisco. The Roman forces were shattered, pushed back into a vulnerable defensive pocket north of the Ebro River, and the entire Iberian strategy faced total, imminent collapse. When the popular assemblies gathered on the Campus Martius to elect a new proconsul to take command of the Spanish theatre, a heavy, paralyzed silence fell over the Roman political class. The assignment was widely viewed as an absolute suicide mission. The enemy possessed 3 veteran armies numbering over 70,000 men, while Rome could only spare a modest reinforcement of 10,000 soldiers. Into this atmospheric void stepped Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger, the son of the fallen general, who was a youth of mere 26 years. Scipio possessed no traditional consular credentials, but he carried an extraordinary, charismatic aura of divine destiny and unyielding willpower. He had survived the catastrophic slaughters at Ticinus and Cannae, and his absolute presence of mind had previously checked a mutiny of young aristocrats who had attempted to abandon the state after the disaster in Apulia. The assemblies, moved by his eloquent passion and burning hunger for familial vengeance, unanimously elected him to the command, breaking with ancient constitutional precedent to grant a private citizen the absolute power of imperium. Scipio arrived in Spain in the summer of 210 before Christ, immediately executing a profound transformation of the administrative and tactical discipline of the remaining Roman forces. He recognized that the 3 Carthaginian generals were deeply divided by personal jealousies and geographic distances, their armies scattered across the interior of the peninsula to suppress native tribal rebellions. Rather than engaging these massive forces in a sequence of risky pitch battles, Scipio engineered a bold, asymmetric counter-strategy, a lightning amphibious strike directly at Carthago Nova, the absolute logistical and political capital of the Punic Empire in Spain. He mobilized his close friend and naval admiral, Gaius Laelius, to coordinate a perfect synchronized movement, drawing 30 war quinquiremes to blockade the city's sea harbors, while Scipio himself marched 25,000 veteran legionaries to invest the landward walls. The siege of Carthago Nova, executed in the spring of 209 before Christ, represents a masterpiece of tactical intelligence and environmental exploitation. The city was a formidable, natural fortress, bordered on 3 sides by the open sea and a deep, stagnant coastal lagoon, leaving only a narrow earthen causeway connecting it to the mainland. While the initial Roman frontal assaults on the main land gates drew the entire Punic garrison into a fierce, bloody conflict along the ramparts, Scipio utilized crucial data gathered from local fishermen regarding the daily movements of the tides. He discovered that a powerful evening wind routinely forced the waters of the lagoon to recede, lowering the level to a depth where men could safely wade through the mud. Under the cover of twilight, Scipio dispatched a chosen vanguard of 500 heavily armed legionaries into the cold waters of the lagoon. Moving silently through the marsh while the Punic defenders were completely focused on the causeway fight, the column scaled the unguarded northern walls, ran through the deserted streets, and threw open the main gates from behind. Carthago Nova fell to the Republic in a single afternoon. The capture was a catastrophic logistical blow to Carthage. Scipio seized an immense hoard of gold and silver coin, vast stores of grain and military equipment, and, most crucially, hundreds of noble Iberian hostages, whom the Barcids had taken to enforce the loyalty of the native clans. Displaying a brilliant diplomatic moderation, Scipio released these hostages completely unhurt, without demanding ransom, instantly detaching the powerful Spanish tribes from their Punic alliance and aligning them directly with the Roman cause. The following year, in 208 before Christ, the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Barca realized that the Roman advance could no longer be contained by simple defensive maneuvering. He consolidated his veteran mercenaries and confronted Scipio at the Battle of Baecula. Scipio, displaying a flexible tactical vision that abandoned the traditional, rigid, front-line advance of the Manipular legion, divided his forces into two independent wings. He utilized a light screen to fix Hasdrubal's center in place, while his two wings executed a rapid, synchronized enveloping maneuver, climbing the steep ridges of the Carthaginian camp to strike the enemy flanks before they could properly deploy their shields. Hasdrubal's lines were shattered, but the Punic general executed a disciplined, fighting retreat. He gathered his remaining treasures, his elite cavalry, and his war elephants, turned his back on Spain, and marched swiftly eastward over the Pyrenees, determined to bring his army directly into Italy to reinforce his brother Hannibal for one final joint assault on Rome. With Hasdrubal's departure, the remaining Carthaginian commanders made a final, desperate attempt to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula, gathering an immense, overwhelming force of 70,000 infantry, 4,000 horsemen, and 32 war elephants at Ilipa in the year 206 before Christ. Scipio marched to meet them with an inferior force of 45,000 men, many of whom were volatile, untried Spanish allies. For several consecutive days, the two armies deployed outside their camps in a tense, breathless standoff. Each day, Scipio followed an identical, highly visible pattern. He led his legions out late in the morning, placing his elite Roman veterans in the deep center of his line and his weaker Spanish allies on the wings, while the Carthaginian general Hasdrubal Gisco mirrored the layout exactly, placing his elite African veterans in his own center to match the Romans. On the decisive morning of the Battle of Ilipa, Scipio executed a complete, brilliant inversion of the tactical landscape. He awakened his troops before dawn, fed them a full breakfast, and deployed them at the absolute first light of morning, placing his heavily armed Roman veterans exclusively on the wings, while pushing his Spanish allies into the center. Hasdrubal Gisco, caught completely by surprise, hurried his hungry, unbreakfasted mercenaries out of their tents to match the sudden deployment. As the battle joined, Scipio ordered his center to hold back in a controlled, slow retreat, preventing the hungry African veterans from engaging in combat. Simultaneously, his elite Roman wings advanced at a rapid, double-time march, wheels turning inward to execute a devastating double envelopment of the weak Carthaginian flanks. The slaughter at Ilipa was absolute and crushing. The Punic flanks collapsed in panic, and the hungry, exhausted African veterans were systematically cut to pieces before they could deploy their lines. Spain was permanently cleared of the Carthaginian presence, its silver mines, grain fields, and ports falling forever into the sovereign grasp of the Roman state. Scipio had achieved an unprecedented strategic triumph. Through his unique synthesis of flexible tactical architecture, psychological intelligence, and diplomatic moderation, he had systematically destroyed the Western Empire of Carthage, avenged the executions of his father and uncle, and prepared a hard, brilliant vanguard that would eventually carry the iron steel of the Republic directly across the sea to face Hannibal Barca on the sands of Africa. While Scipio the Younger was systematically dismantling the Barcid Empire in Spain, the Italian mainland remained locked in a tense, exhausted operational stalemate. For 11 grueling years since the disaster at Cannae, Hannibal Barca had marched his veteran mercenaries across the southern landscapes of Italy, but the defensive framework of the Fabian strategy had successfully contained his geopolitical momentum. The Republic had slowly recaptured its defected cities, including Capua and Tarentum, turning the war into a slow, suffocating circle of attrition. Yet, the strategic calculus of the entire Mediterranean conflict was suddenly shattered in the early spring of 207 before Christ. News reached the Curia Hostilia that Hasdrubal Barca, having slipped away from Scipio's forces after the Battle of Baecula, had successfully duplicated his brother's legendary feat. He had crossed the Pyrenees, marched through Gaul, navigated the snowbound passes of the Alps with an unexpected, rapid precision, and descended into the Po Valley with a powerful reinforcement army of 30,000 veteran infantry, 10,000 Gallic and Ligurian allies, and 15 formidable war elephants. The arrival of Hasdrubal created an absolute existential panic inside the Roman Senate. The Republic was currently floating on a dangerous financial abyss, its agricultural fields ruined by a decade of scorched earth warfare, and its human resources pushed to the absolute limit of demographic exhaustion. If Hasdrubal successfully marched southward through the center of the peninsula to link his fresh, heavily armed legions with Hannibal's veteran mercenaries, the combined Barcid war machine would possess over 80,000 disciplined soldiers, a massive force that would easily smash the defensive lines of the Republic and march directly upon the undefended gates of Rome. To confront this dual-headed terror, the popular assemblies elected two bitter political rivals to the consular chairs. The stern, veteran patrician, Marcus Livius Salinator, dispatched to the north to block Hasdrubal's advance, and the aggressive, highly experienced plebeian Gaius Claudius Nero, stationed in the south to pin Hannibal down in Apulia. The turning point of the entire campaign was determined by an unexpected intelligence interception. Hasdrubal had dispatched 4 loyal Numidian horsemen to gallop through the length of Italy to deliver a secret, written dispatch to his brother. The letter detailed Hasdrubal's exact operational blueprint. He intended to march his army through Umbria, down the Adriatic coast, and meet Hannibal in the fertile plains of Picenum for a joint assault on the capital. However, the Numidian messengers lost their bearings in the unfamiliar terrain of central Italy, blundered directly into a Roman foraging party near Tarentum, and were captured. The letter, written in clear Punic characters, was brought directly to the camp of the consul Gaius Claudius Nero in Apulia. Nero, reading the dispatch by the dim light of his campfire, recognized with a brilliant tactical clarity that the survival of Rome required an immediate, unprecedented violation of traditional military protocol. Under the rigid constitutional laws of the Republic, a consul was strictly barred from leading his legions outside his designated theatre of command without the formal approval of the Senate. Nero chose to ignore these bureaucratic limitations. Leaving a thin screen of light infantry and deceptive watch fires in his camp to convince Hannibal that his main force was still stationary in Apulia, Nero hand-picked 7,000 of his elite veteran legionaries, 6,000 infantry, and 1,000 cavalry, and slipped out into the darkness of midnight. He launched a spectacular, double-time march northward along the Adriatic highway, covering over 250 miles in less than 7 days. Along the route, Roman citizens lined the roads, offering food, water, and fresh pack animals to the passing column, cheering these soldiers who were racing against time to alter the destiny of the state. Nero entered the northern camp of his consular colleague, Marcus Livius Salinator, under the cover of a pitch-black night, quietly integrating his veteran troops into the existing tents to prevent the enemy from noticing the sudden expansion of the Roman lines. The next morning, as Hasdrubal Barca led his army out of his camp along the banks of the Metaurus River to prepare for a routine deployment, his experienced military eyes caught a subtle, troubling shift in the acoustic environment of the Roman lines. He noticed that the ceremonial trumpets of the magistrates sounded twice from the consular camp instead of once, indicating that both Roman consuls were now present on the northern battlefield. Recognizing that his brother Hannibal must have been defeated, bypassed, or pinned down in the south, Hasdrubal ordered an immediate tactical retreat under the cover of twilight, intending to withdraw his heavily laden baggage trains and elephants back across the Metaurus River to seek safety within the friendly territory of the Gauls. However, the retreat quickly dissolved into a logistical nightmare. Hasdrubal's local Italian guides betrayed him, abandoning the column in the dark and leaving the Punic forces trapped along the steep, muddy banks of the swollen river, unable to find a safe wading ford. As the grey morning mist broke over the valley, The combined armies of Nero and Salinator caught up to the retreating Carthaginians, forcing Hasdrubal to draw his lines in a desperate, defensive position. He placed his fierce Spanish and African veterans on his right flank to anchor the line, packed his untrustworthy Gallic allies on his left atop a steep, rocky hill that defied frontal assault, and positioned his 15 war elephants in his center to act as a moving wall of iron against the Roman center. The Battle of the Metaurus, fought in the summer of 207 before Christ, was a brutal, hacking collision of absolute willpower. The Roman center under Salinator suffered catastrophic casualties as the Carthaginian war elephants charged through the lines, their tusks ripping through shields and bone. On the Roman right flank, Gaius Claudius Nero found his advance completely blocked by the steep, rocky ravine that protected the Gallic positions. Realizing that he could not achieve a breakthrough in his assigned sector, Nero executed a brilliant, spontaneous tactical innovation. He withdrew his 6,000 veteran legionaries entirely from the right wing, marched them quietly behind the main Roman line, and burst unexpectedly upon the completely exposed right flank and rear of Hasdrubal's Spanish veterans. This sweeping flanking maneuver completely crushed the cohesion of the Carthaginian army. The Roman legionaries, moving behind a wall of heavy rectangular shields, used their short gladii to systematically cut through the unarmored flanks of the Punic mercenaries. As the battle turned into a slaughter, Hasdrubal's war elephants panicked under a rain of iron javelins, turning back to trample their own infantry. To contain this chaos, the elephant riders used heavy mallets and iron chisels to drive spikes directly into the skulls of their own beasts, dropping them dead in the dirt. Hasdrubal Barca, realizing that his army was utterly destroyed, his dynastic ambitions broken, and his hope for victory lost, refused to flee the field. He spurred his horse directly into the thickest mass of a Roman cohort, fighting with a savage, lonely fury until he was run through by a dozen legionary blades, a noble, tragic death that mirrored the martial pride of his family line. Gaius Claudius Nero did not permit his soldiers a single moment of rest to celebrate the victory. He gathered his 7,000 veterans, packed his baggage trains, and marched swiftly back to his southern lines in Apulia, entering his original camp before Hannibal had even noticed his absence. In his saddlebags, Nero carried a horrific, calculated message for the Punic general. Under the cover of night, a Roman horseman rode up to the perimeter of Hannibal's pickets, throwing a heavy burlap sack over the timber palisades into the dirt. When the Punic guards opened the sack and brought its contents to Hannibal's tent, the general looked down into the pale, severed face of his brother Hasdrubal, whose head had been crudely cut off by Roman lictors on the northern battlefield. Hannibal sat in absolute silence in the dim light, looking upon the ruined features of the brother who had marched across the world to save him. He recognized with an absolute, chilling clarity that the Republic had achieved a total, definitive strategic mastery over his dynasty. Rome could lose 80,000 men at Cannae and rise to execute a double consular march across the length of Italy, while Carthage could no longer protect its own princes. Turning to his officers, Hannibal pronounced a dark, prophetic sentence that marked the psychological end of his invasion. "I see there the total fate of Carthage." He broke his camps, ordered his remaining garrisons to abandon the rich territories of Lucania and Apulia, and withdrew his broken forces into the rugged, defensive mountains of Bruttium, a lonely, isolated enclave where he would spend the next 4 years waiting in silence for the final, inevitable summons from the shores of Africa. The brilliant victory at the Metaurus River and the total clearance of the Punic presence from Spain allowed the Roman Republic to fundamentally shift its global strategic axis. No longer content to wage a defensive war of containment within the boundaries of the Italian peninsula, the Senate began to contemplate a definitive, offensive strike at the very heart of the Carthaginian Empire in North Africa. When Publius Cornelius Scipio returned to Rome from his Iberian triumphs in the winter of 205 before Christ, the popular assemblies enthusiastically elected him to the consulship, demanding that the young hero be granted the immediate authority to launch an invasion of Tunis. However, the conservative factions within the Senate, led by the unyielding, cautious Quintus Fabius Maximus, fiercely resisted this aggressive blueprint, arguing that it was an act of absolute madness to strip Italy of its defensive legions, while Hannibal Barca remained entrenched in the mountains of Bruttium. Bypassing this aristocratic gridlock through his immense public popularity, Scipio secured the province of Sicily as his base, with the Senate granting him the right to accept volunteers, but refusing to allocate him a single formal state legion. Undeterred by this political obstruction, Scipio transformed the island of Sicily into a sophisticated, high-intensity military crucible. He mobilized thousands of eager volunteers from the Latin cities, requisitioned vast timber and grain supplies from the local markets, and systematically absorbed the remnants of the infamous Cannae legions, those disgraced citizen soldiers who had been exiled to Sicily for over a decade as a punishment for surviving the Punic slaughter in Apulia. Scipio recognized that these broken veterans were possessed by a burning, desperate hunger for social redemption and structural vengeance. He spent an entire year retraining these men in his advanced, highly flexible tactical systems, equipping them with the uniform armor and double-edged gladii that had conquered Spain, and integrating them with a powerful allied cavalry force under the command of Massinissa, a brilliant prince of the Numidian Massili tribe who had abandoned his Carthaginian alliance to swear a permanent loyalty to the Roman cause. In the spring of 204 before Christ, Scipio launched his monumental African venture, crossing the Mediterranean with a magnificent invasion fleet of 400 transport ships and 50 heavily armed warships to land at Cape Bon. The strategic shockwave inside North Africa was instantaneous and catastrophic. Scipio's veteran legions executed a sequence of devastating campaigns, utilizing a terrifying midnight raid to burn the combined wood and reed military camps of Hasdrubal Gisco and the Numidian king Syphax, incinerating over 40,000 enemy mercenaries in a single night. When Scipio subsequently crushed their reformed lines at the Battle of the Great Plains, capturing the strategic city of Utica and threatening Tunis, the Carthaginian elders fell into a state of absolute existential panic. Recognizing that their empire was on the lip of total collapse, they dispatched a frantic maritime summons across the sea, ordering Hannibal Barca to immediately abandon his isolated mountain base in Italy and return to defend his fatherland. Hannibal received the royal summons with a bitter, lonely fury, recognizing that his 15 years of relentless tactical triumphs on the Italian mainland had been completely neutralized by the strategic vision of his younger rival. He evacuated his veteran mercenaries from Bruttium, packed his fleets, and landed at Leptis Minor in the autumn of 203 before Christ, drawing his lines in the fertile agricultural plains of Zama, 5 days' march south of Carthage. The political and military tension across the Mediterranean basin reached an absolute, breathless climax. The two ultimate masters of global warfare, neither of whom had ever lost a major field campaign, were now deployed on the exact same piece of earth to determine who would dictate the sovereign destiny of the known world. On the morning of the 19th of October, in the year 202 before Christ, the two colossal armies faced each other across the dusty plain of Zama. Hannibal commanded a formidable force of 36,000 infantry, 4,000 horsemen, and 80 massive war elephants, the largest elephant vanguard he had ever brought to a single battlefield. To absorb the initial shock of the Roman advance, he arranged his infantry in 3 separate, distinct lines. His first line consisted of volatile Ligurian and Celtic mercenaries. His second line was formed by fresh Punic and African levies, while his final line, held back over 200 yards as a supreme tactical reserve, was comprised exclusively of his iron-hard Italian veterans, those elite mercenaries who had slaughtered the legions at Trasimene and Cannae. Scipio deployed an identical force of 29,000 citizen soldiers and 6,000 elite Numidian and Roman cavalry under Massinissa and Laelius, his legions arranged in his characteristic 3-tiered, checkerboard framework. The Battle of Zama opened with a terrifying, earth-shaking charge from Hannibal's 80 war elephants, intended to smash through the front lines of the Roman infantry and scatter their cohesion before the hand-to-hand combat joined. Scipio, anticipating this precise opening gambit, executed a brilliant, spontaneous architectural modification of his lines. Instead of deploying his maniples in the traditional, interlocking quincunx pattern that presented a solid wall of wood and iron, he ordered his rear lines to shift their alignment, stacking directly behind the front line hastati to create wide, unobstructed vertical columns that cut completely through the depth of his army. As the colossal beasts surged into the Roman ranks, Scipio's military tribunes raised a deafening, piercing blast from hundreds of bronze trumpets and horns, while the legionaries struck their heavy short swords against their rectangular shields. The sudden explosion of sound panicked the elephants. Many turned back in a frenzy to trample their own Carthaginian cavalry on the wings, while the remaining beasts charged blindly down the wide, open horizontal lanes that Scipio had meticulously prepared for them. The Roman soldiers stood along the wooden walls of these lanes, systematically raining iron javelins and arrows into the flanks of the passing beasts, channeling them safely through the rear of the army without allowing a single maniple to be broken. With the elephant threat successfully neutralized, Scipio's elite cavalry under Massinissa and Laelius launched a crushing charge on the wings, utterly routing the Punic horsemen and pursuing them off the immediate field of battle. The infantry lines then collided in a brutal, exhausting, close-quarters combat. The Roman hastati hacked through Hannibal's first line of mercenaries and his second line of Punic levies, but their momentum was completely halted as they slammed into the iron wall of Hannibal's veteran third line. These Italian veterans, fresh, highly disciplined, and fighting with the savage desperation of men who had no home left to return to, systematically checked the Roman advance, their long shields locked in an unyielding barrier that threatened to exhaust the Roman strength. In this supreme, decisive moment of the conflict, Scipio executed a magnificent, high-stakes tactical re-architecture of his entire army in the middle of active combat. He ordered a trumpet signal to sound a retreat for his exhausted hastati, commanding them to hold their ground in a defensive center. Simultaneously, he deployed his principes and veteran triarii out from behind the front line, extending them far to the left and right until his army was transformed into a single, immense, continuous horizontal line that perfectly matched the width of Hannibal's veterans. This total extension prevented the Carthaginians from outflanking his positions, turning the battle into a static, agonizing test of pure physical endurance and sword discipline, where individual men cut through muscle and bone beneath the blazing African sun. The apocalyptic deadlock was shattered late in the afternoon by the sudden dramatic return of the Roman and Numidian cavalry. Massinissa and Laelius, having broken the Punic horsemen on the horizon, swept back onto the immediate field of battle, driving their heavy cavalry columns directly into the exposed rear of Hannibal's veteran line. The envelopment was absolute. Caught in a vice of stone-cold infantry steel from the front and kinetic cavalry force from behind, the Carthaginian army collapsed into a total industrial slaughter. Over 20,000 Punic mercenaries and veterans were systematically cut down where they stood, while thousands of others fled blindly into the desert. Hannibal Barca himself escaped the carnage with a handful of horsemen, galloping frantically back to Carthage to deliver a stark, unritualized verdict to his government. "I have lost not merely a battle, but the war." The victory at Zama was the definitive, crowning achievement of the early Republic, permanently breaking the back of the Punic civilization and elevating Publius Cornelius Scipio to the highest peaks of historical glory, honored ever after with the cognomen Africanus. Carthage was forced to sign a crushing, humiliating peace treaty that permanently stripped her of her global empire. She surrendered all her territories outside of Africa, burned her magnificent war fleet of 500 quinqueremes before the eyes of the Roman magistrates, and was prohibited from ever waging war anywhere in the world without the formal, written permission of the Roman Senate. The long, multi-generational epic of the Punic Wars was ended, and as the silver tribute from Africa began to pour steadily into the treasury on the Tiber, the Roman Republic stepped across the ultimate threshold of regional hegemony, its system of law, military discipline, and unyielding willpower, now positioned to expand across the entire length of the Mediterranean world. The total capitulation of Carthage on the sands of Africa permanently re-architected the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. In the span of a single century, the rustic settlement of huts by the Tiber had evolved from a fragile river kingdom into the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Yet, as the Roman Senate looked toward the eastern horizon, they confronted a deeply sophisticated, highly volatile state system, the Hellenistic world. This was a realm dominated by the wealthy, proud successor kingdoms of Alexander the Great Macedon, the Seleucid Empire, and Ptolemaic Egypt. These empires possessed immense financial capital, massive cities packed with philosophers and artisans, and military machines anchored to the legendary Macedonian phalanx, a dense wall of professional soldiers wielding 18-foot pike sarissas. To the aristocratic kings of the East, the Roman Republic was still a collection of Western barbarians. To the Roman Senate, the East was a landscape of dangerous, unstable autocracies whose wealth and ambitions threatened to disrupt the global balance of power. The diplomatic catalyst for Rome's eastward expansion was triggered by the aggressive geopolitical ambitions of King Philip V of Macedon and Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. Recognizing that the defeat of Carthage had left a power vacuum, these monarchs executed a secret pact to partition the territories of Egypt and the Aegean sea lanes. When the independent Greek city-states and trading powers, including Rhodes and Pergamum, appealed desperately to the Tiber for military protection, the Roman Senate hesitated. The citizen soldiers of the Republic were exhausted by decades of Punic warfare and desired a winter of domestic respiration. However, the elite patrician families argued that if Macedon consolidated its grip over Greece, it would eventually build a fleet to cross the Adriatic and invade the Italian mainland. Moved by a strategy of proactive defense and a growing hunger for global prestige, the Centuriate assemblies voted to cross the sea, launching the Macedonian and Syrian wars. The historical collision between the Roman modular legion and the Greek phalanx was resolved in the rugged, uneven landscapes of Greece. At the decisive Battle of Cynoscephalae in the year 197 before Christ, the consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus confronted Philip V atop a series of limestone ridges known as the Dog's Heads. The initial clash was terrifying. The dense Macedonian right wing, its 18-foot pikes, leveled in a solid wall of iron wood, drove down the hill, smashing through the frontline Roman hastati and forcing a heavy retreat. However, as the phalanx advanced across the broken, rocky terrain, its long pikes caught on the boulders and ditches, causing small, microscopic fractures to open across its front line. A brilliant, anonymous Roman military tribune on the right flank recognized this structural vulnerability. He gathered 20 independent maniples of veteran legionaries, bypassed the main clash, and wheeled his troops directly into the completely exposed rear and flanks of the advancing Macedonian wall. The phalanx, a rigid military machine built exclusively for forward impact, could not turn its massive pikes to defend its rear. The Roman legionaries, moving behind their heavy rectangular shields, used their short gladii to systematically slip under the long pikes, executing a brutal close-quarters slaughter that shattered the Macedonian army in less than an hour. The tactical lesson was absolute. The rigid wall of the East had been completely outflexed by the fluid checkerboard of the West. At the subsequent Isthmian Games, Flamininus pronounced a spectacular decree, declaring all the Greek city-states entirely free from royal Macedonian dominion, a brilliant diplomatic stroke that positioned Rome as the ultimate arbiter of Greek liberty, while rendering the entire region an indirect political dependency of the Republic. This eastern expansion brought an unimaginable, unprecedented tidal wave of material wealth, fine art, and cultural luxury directly into the rustic markets of the capital. Tens of thousands of sophisticated Greek statues, silver tapestries, and scientific manuscripts were transported up the Tiber, while an influx of educated Greek slaves filled patrician households as tutors, architects, and administrative secretaries. Yet, this sudden wealth catalyzed a profound moral and social crisis that threatened to erode the ancient, unyielding foundation of the mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. Traditionalist statesmen, led by the fierce, austere censor Cato the Elder, loudly denounced this systemic influx of Hellenistic culture, arguing that foreign philosophy, luxury perfumes, and exotic banquets were softening the internal steel of the Roman youth, replacing the rugged agrarian virtues of discipline, piety, and frugality with a dangerous, individualistic decay. Cato famously encapsulated his geopolitical anxiety regarding the remaining embers of foreign resistance with a singular, repetitive sentence that he pronounced at the close of every Senate speech: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The tragic, dual-headed climax of this global expansion reached its absolute fulfillment in the fateful year 146 before Christ. In the West, a desperate, final border dispute prompted the Senate to unleash its ultimate vengeance upon Carthage, launching the Third Punic War. Under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, the Roman legions systematically breached the massive sea walls of the North African capital, launching a brutal, room-by-room urban assault through the 6-story tenements that lasted for 6 straight days and nights. When the city finally fell, its remaining 50,000 half-starved citizens were sold into absolute slavery. The Senate commanded that every stone palace, harbour installation, and temple be systematically razed to the ground, leaving only a smoking, desolated plain of black ash, a horrific display of absolute state power that permanently erased the Punic civilization from the face of the earth. Simultaneously, across the Adriatic, the ancient, wealthy Greek metropolis of Corinth attempted a final, ill-fated rebellion against Roman administrative dictates. The consul Lucius Mummius crushed the Greek forces outside the city gates, entered the undefended capital, and executed an identical pattern of structural destruction. He slaughtered the male population, enslaved the women and children, plundered the priceless art treasures for the Roman treasury, and burned the entire city to a pile of charred stone. The dual destructions of Carthage and Corinth in 146 before Christ signaled to the ancient world that the Republic had outgrown its old role as a regional peacekeeper. It was now an uncompromising, global empire that ruled through absolute intimidation and administrative dictation. As the centuries pass softly and the story of early Rome carries you into a deep, restful sleep, we leave the city at its ultimate peak of global dominance. The mud huts of the prehistoric dawn on the Tiber have been replaced by a sprawling metropolis of glittering marble forums, monumental stone sewers, and paved military highways that stretch across the horizons of 3 continents. The Republic had conquered every king, smashed every wall, and mastered every wave through its unmatched capacity for structural discipline, political adaptability, and unyielding human willpower. Yet, the very wealth and unchecked ambition that had built this global empire had planted the toxic, internal seeds for a far more terrifying transformation. The external enemies were gone, the frontiers were secure, and the stage was perfectly set for a century of civil fractures, revolutionary dictators, and the slow, majestic unraveling of the Republic into the grand, glittering autocracy of the Roman Empire. Let the ancient stars shine down upon the silent stones of the Forum, and let the long memory of Rome guide your spirit into a quiet, undisturbed rest.